Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show.
Besides, with the continuous, overbearing suppression, the unique laws contained in the image of Mount Tai continued to penetrate Rabus' body. The crowd could even clearly see that a large number of incredibly arcane magic runes had formed a large net that was constantly sealing its power. This is too terrifying. Bradler now regretted his decision. Had he known earlier that the magic scroll was that powerful, he would have done whatever it took to get it, even if it meant that he had to spend all the money in the royal family's treasury. At this juncture, he couldn't help but blame Grand Duke Viti. If the latter hadn't said that the magic scroll was only a master-level piece, Bradler would have never given up on it. Master level? How can a master-level magic scroll possibly suppress the wild whale Rabu that's a demigod? The people who had once competed with the Octopus clan during the auction of the magic scroll shared the same thought with Bradler. At this moment, Grand Duke Viti had almost become their enemy, and everyone was full of resentment towards him. After witnessing the power of the magic scroll, everyone looked at Lin Li in a completely different light. They thought, who is this person? He's only in his early 20s, and not only has he reached the sanctuary realm in the field of magic, he also has such an unimaginable attainment in the field of inscription. Well, ordinary people might not be able to achieve stellar attainments in their lifetime even if they specialized only in one field, let alone in multiple fields. However, Lin Li did not care about the fact that they were staring at him. The divine smith level mageth that the immortal king had left behind was able to suppress even powerful ancient deities, while his was worlds apart from that because it was only able to suppress a wild whale that was a demigod. With that comparison, Lin Li didn't feel proud when he saw the power that his work was unleashing at this moment. Instead, he felt a strong sense of dissatisfaction. The immortal king, who could suppress ancient deities, was far beyond what Lin Li could compare to, and Lin Li felt that his abilities were really insignificant. Only those who didn't have wide horizons would kick up such a fuss. If the immortal king was there, he might mock this magic scroll for being juvenile. Of course, Lin Li was also very confident that as long as he continued to study diligently, he might be able to reach the level that the immortal king was at, or even surpass it. Finally, under the strong pressure of the magic scroll, Mount Tai, Rabu sunk to the bottom of the sea and deeper into the seabed. The ferocious Rabu, which was releasing its wrath just now, had stopped roaring as it could no longer struggle at this point. It wasn't that it had resigned to fate, but rather all the power in its body had already been suppressed and sealed. The crowd that was watching from outside ignored the danger and dived deep to the bottom of the sea at this moment to look at Rabu, which used to be the scourge of the endless ocean. In particular, Bradler had to see Rabu being in a powerless state with his very own eyes. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to continue living on Four Seasons Island with a peace of mind. Is it all over? A large, deep pit had formed at the bottom of the sea, and it seemed to be connected to the endless abyss. It was formed entirely by the power of the magic scroll, which had dragged Rabu to the bottom of the sea and further into the seabed. When standing around the pit, they could only roughly see the image of Mount Tai. Great monarch Hegel of the Octopus clan looked at Lin Li, who was near him, while stimulating the power of the magic scroll. He carefully asked, "Masterfully, can we stop now?" Although Hegel's attainment in the field of inscription was not low, this was the first time he had used a magic scroll that involved some divine smith level elements. Hence, he didn't know much about the power of this magic scroll, and was afraid that Rabu would emerge again once he put away the magic scroll. Lin Li was naturally very confident in his work. He nodded at Hegel and said, "Put it away, the power of that wild whale has been suppressed, and it can't escape." In fact, Hegel's worry was exactly the same as that of the others. Besides, for Bradler, suppressing Rabu there was akin to putting a time bomb in the Gilded Kingdom. If he didn't get a clear idea of the situation, Bradler would probably get nightmares every day on Four Seasons Island in the future. Hence, Bradler carefully walked towards Lin Li and asked in a respectful tone, "Masterfully, that wild whale Rabu isn't going to come out again, right? Can you please give us a similar magic scroll, like the one you've just used, so that we will be able to suppress that wild whale, in case it emerges again?" Bradler had thought of a good plan, and decided to take this opportunity to request Lin Li to draw him a magic scroll like Mount Tai. It was a magic scroll that could suppress Rabu and exude power that was close to the power of the deities, making it a priceless item. Lin Li naturally knew what Bradler's intentions were. He smiled and said, "Your Majesty, not to worry, wild whale Rabu has already been suppressed, and its power will slowly be depleted. By the time the power of the magic scroll dissipates, Rabu's strength will only be at the legendary level, and no longer pose a threat to you. Who knows if it's true or not? You may have suppressed wild whale Rabu here, but if it escapes again, the ones to suffer will be the Gilded Kingdom. Maybe that was your intention all along." and you just want to leave us with this threat. Hearing Lin Li's words, Kantori immediately couldn't help but interject. Anyway, the wild whale Rabu had been suppressed, and the magic scroll was in Lin Li's hands. He really didn't want to see Lin Li become the savior of the Gilded Kingdom, so he wanted to take this opportunity to plant that thought in Bradler's head. Kantori did have a point. The fact that Rabu was suppressed in the waters of Four Seasons Island meant that it would forever pose a huge threat to the Gilded Kingdom. Although Lin Li was very firm in his stand that Rabu wouldn't escape, they were still paranoid and worried about it. Given the current situation, Bradler and the ministers of the Gilded Kingdom obviously couldn't put their minds at ease. Besides, the relationship between Lin Li and the Gilded Kingdom was not exactly close-knit. In fact, they had even gotten into a conflict before. Hence, no one could be certain that Lin Li really didn't hold a grudge against them, and that Rabu had really been suppressed, and would no longer be a threat to the Gilded Kingdom. It would have been fine to make such a conjecture in private. However, Kantori was too reckless to have said those words in front of everyone. As soon as he spoke, the Siren clan and Octopus clan, who wished to have a good relationship with Lin Li, as well as those who were in neutral positions, immediately looked sullen. In the eyes of the Siren clan and Octopus clan, Kantori was biting the hand that fed him, and exacting revenge on his savior. Although the magic scroll was in the hands of the Octopus clan, Lin Li was ultimately its original creator. The magic scroll had suppressed Rabu, and helped the Gilded Kingdom overcome this ordeal. Yet, Kantori was not only ungrateful, he even began to suspect Lin Li. Moreover, the ones who were controlling the magic scroll were the Octopus clan. If anything, the Octopus clan would have been suspected too. Bradler didn't expect Kantori, who was usually magnanimous and smart, would suddenly be so muddled up at this moment. The king was initially thinking about how he could get closer to Lin Li, but Kantori's words had just disrupted his plans. Kantori, shut up. At the end of the day, Bradler was the king of the Gilded Kingdom, and although he was usually more polite to Kantori because the latter was the disciple of the Illuminatus Lord, he couldn't care less at this time. Bradler's outrage instantly made Kantori freeze in shock. Since he became a disciple of the Lord of the Illuminati, he had never been reprimanded so harshly by Bradler, which led him to no longer take Bradler seriously even though the latter was the king. However, Bradler's current austerity made him realize that the king was still the king, whom he couldn't ignore or disregard at this point. Almost immediately after Bradler's angry rebuke, Saint Edmund of the Illuminati glared at Kantori with extreme dissatisfaction, and sternly chastised, "Kantori, you're going overboard. Hurry up and apologize to President Flick immediately." Saint Edmund was now certain that Lin Li had made another huge breakthrough in his attainments in the field of inscription, which meant that there was hope for speeding up the resurrection of the founding saint, Lord Aquilo. Under such circumstances, he would never allow anyone in the Illuminati to offend Lin Li, not even the three other saints, let alone Kantori. Even if the Lord was here, Saint Edmund would not change his stand. Kantori was surprised by King Bradler's rebuke, but Saint Edmund's words were a huge blow to him. Kantori had always prided himself on the fact that he was the disciple of the Lord of the Illuminati, and was the most promising candidate for the successor of the Illuminati. With such a status, he had never suffered such a treatment before. What Kantori found the most difficult to accept was the fact that the people of the Gilded Kingdom and Illuminati were not the only ones around. The several sea clans and various human forces were also present. Yet, he was now being made to apologize to Lin Li, the president of a force from the breezy plains. Even though Lin Li had unimaginable attainments in the field of inscription, it still made Kantori feel extremely humiliated. However, Kantori did not dare to have the slightest disrespect for Saint Edmund. After all, he had yet to become the next lord of the Illuminati. Besides, even the current lord would treat the saints of the four sanctuaries of the Illuminati with great respect. Hence, even though Kantori's identity and status might seem impressive to others, he was nothing to Saint Edmund. If he were to anger Saint Edmund, Kantori might possibly be dismissed as a disciple of the Lord, let alone become the future successor to the current Lord. Faced with the double pressure of Bradler and Saint Edmund, Kantori had no choice but to swallow his pride reluctantly even though it would bruise his ego. Even his father, Burgess, and the ministers who were close to them didn't dare to stand out to speak up for him. In a moment of helplessness, Kantori had no choice but to turn to Lin Li and face him with a forced smile on his face. He said, "President Flick, please forgive me. I was just too worried about the safety of the kingdom. I didn't mean to be so callous with my words. I hope to seek your understanding." Although Kantori was apologizing, he didn't sound apologetic at all, because he had first used his concern as an excuse, and even expected Lin Li to understand the reason for his offensive words. However, Lin Li did not take it seriously, either. Before Kantori finished speaking, he turned to Bradler and the others before saying, "Your Majesty, since the wild whale Rabu has been suppressed, I'll get going. I have something else to tend to. After saying this, Lin Li reached his finger out and slid it in the air to form a spatial rift, which he then stepped into together with Kantoris. Kantori's face became beet red immediately, and he watched the spatial rift close gradually before disappearing completely, unable to contain his resentment anymore. Standing rooted to the ground, he clenched his fists so tightly that his nails were digging into his flesh, but he didn't feel the pain at all. He even began trembling a little. What a shameful thing to do. I've swallowed my pride to apologize to him, but not only did he not say something nice in return, he even ignored me completely. Faced with Lin Li's blatant disregard, Kantori felt even more humiliated than when Bradler and Saint Edmund made him apologize to Lin Li in front of everyone. In Kantori's opinion, Lin Li should have at least said something kind to him out of courtesy after hearing his apology, even if it didn't move him to tears. Kantori thought that since he had already stooped low to apologize, Lin Li ought to say that he didn't take it to heart and forgive him. Yet, Lin Li didn't even look at him, and instead merely bade farewell to Bradler before leaving via a spatial rift. Kantori felt that he was left alone looking like a fool. The biggest issue that bothered Kantori was the fact that there were many people around who had watched him, the promising elite of the younger generation of the Gilded Kingdom, getting ignored and disregarded blatantly. He could no longer hold his head high again. Anger simmered within him, and was consuming his sanity down to the very last trace. Fortunately, Kantori's father, Burgess, who knew his son well, walked forward and patted Kantori on his shoulder at this moment. He said, "Okay, President Philip clearly understands the concerns that you have for the Gilded Kingdom, and he has merely taken his leave because an urgent matter has cropped up. We should get going too." Of course, Burgess was lying through his teeth because everyone could tell clearly what Lin Li's attitude was like. However, the rest of them didn't have any feud with the Gilded Kingdom, and were aware of Kantori's status in the Illuminati, after all. Hence, no one stated it explicitly in Kantori's face. In fact, the vast majority of the crowd didn't even bother to pay attention to Kantori, because all their attention was on the information they had inferred from that magic scroll. Wild whale Rabu was already a demigod, but it was actually so easily suppressed by the power of the magic scroll named Mount Tai, which left them wondering just what level the magic scroll was at and how high Lin Li's attainments in the field of inscription were. As long as one had brains, they would probably be able to imagine that the level of the power that was unleashed had to have been close to the divine level since it could suppress wild whale Rabu. In that case, there was no way the magic scroll was only at the peak of the master level, and they reckoned that it was probably near the divine smith level. Based on further inference, they deduced that Lin Li, the young president of the Tower of Dusk, probably had inscription attainments that were at the divine smith level, if not close to it. Gurus of inscription were considered rare in the entire Anral, even among the Octopus clan, that had high attainments in inscription. As for inscribers, who were at the divine smith level, there were probably less than 5 even in myths and legends, let alone in Anral. Of course, they also knew that if Lin Li had really become a divine smith of inscription, it would have been tantamount to reaching the divine realm, and he would have long become a true deity. Hence, they deduced that Lin Li should only be approaching the level of a divine smith of inscription, and the level of his inscription knowledge was probably just touching the divine smith level. However, even if he wasn't a divine smith of inscription, Lin Li's attainments in inscription were still unprecedented in Anral. Faced with such a situation, the people present could not help but think about how they should get along with such an impressive figure, who was close to the divine smith level in the future. The ones who were the happiest about this discovery were none other than Queen Halia and Prince Cleve of the Siren clan, as well as Great Monarch Hegel and Grand Elder Hayes of the Octopus clan. Through the suppression of wild whale Rabu, Hegel and Hayes had both witnessed the full power of this magic scroll, and were completely certain that it was close to the level of the divine smith. At this moment, both of them were feeling thankful and fortunate that they had decided to spend 400 million gold coins on this magic scroll, and had not missed it because of the staggering price. Initially, Hegel and Hayes intended to meet Lin Li immediately after Rabu was suppressed so that they could take advantage of this opportunity to befriend him. However, to their dismay, Lin Li decided to leave through a spatial rift after speaking to Bradler briefly, perhaps because of Kantori. That made them feel inevitably regretful and also resentful towards Kantori. In fact, they even considered making Harquis cut off all contact with Kantori after they returned. Putting aside the feud between Kantori and Lin Li, in Hegel and Hayes' opinion, it was really foolish of Kantori to have said those words just now. As the prince of the Octopus clan, Harquis would succeed Hegel to become the great monarch of the clan in the future, and it wouldn't be a good thing for him to keep hanging out with a stupid person like Kantori lest he was affected. Queen Halia and Prince Cleve of the Siren clan were really overjoyed after ascertaining that Lin Li's attainments in the field of inscription were close to the divine smith level. Previously at the auction venue, they had already spoken to Lin Li and requested him to visit the Siren clan sometime to help them draw a Magath that would be complementary to the heart of all evil, to which Lin Li agreed. They initially just thought of having a master of inscription, like Lin Li, to help them create a Magath, but it turned out that he was a guru of inscription who was reaching the divine smith level. To Halia and Cleve, Lin Li's agreement to do them that favor was something that no amount of money could buy. Besides, it was obviously still a good opportunity for them to get closer to Lin Li. Hence, while they were rejoicing about the fact that they had obtained such a great chance, Queen Halia and Prince Cleve couldn't help but despise and look down on Kantori, who had just offended Lin Li even more. Although they didn't know what feud there was between Kantori and Lin Li, they felt that regardless of the reason, it was still very unwise of Kantori to offend Lin Li, a guru of inscription, without regard for the interests of the kingdom. On the contrary, Grina, the prince of the giant shark clan, was somewhat impressed with Kantori and couldn't help but take another glance at him. He could tell from Kantori's behavior that Kantori detested Lin Li to the extent that he couldn't tolerate the other party's presence at all. For Grina, who also regarded Lin Li as his enemy, Kantori was undoubtedly someone worth getting close to because he could be of great help to him in dealing with Lin Li. Although Lin Li's magic scroll had indeed shocked Grina, the giant shark clan had always resorted to using brute force to solve problems, and they were contemptuous about things like Magaths. In Grina's opinion, even if the magic scroll could suppress the terrifying power of wild whale Rabu, it wouldn't pose a threat to his giant shark knights. No matter how powerful the magic scroll may be, can it also destroy tens of thousands of giant shark knights in one go? Grina was extremely confident in the giant shark knights of his clan. Besides, Lin Li still wasn't an actual divine smith yet, and even the true deities were not invincible, let alone a person who was just close to the divine smith level. Great, this disaster is finally over. Thanks for helping us, everyone. I have some things to attend to, so I will take my leave now, said Saint Edmund, who was rather dissatisfied with Kantori's attitude. After thanking those who had intervened to help deal with Rabu, he left with Elder Zoomer without even taking another look at Kantori. More importantly, of course, Saint Edmund was eager to meet Lin Li to discuss the matter of resurrecting Lord Aquilo, the founding saint. Since Lin Li's attainments in the field of inscription had reached a level that was close to the divine smith level, there should probably be some hope in resurrecting the saint ahead of schedule. For Saint Edmund, nothing was more important than the resurrection of the founding saint, Aquilo. If not for the fact that they still needed Kantori for other purposes, he would have probably beheaded Kantori and brought his head to Lin Li. Staring at the back of Saint Edmund, who was leaving, Kantori knew that he had offended him as well. Although he was not sure why Saint Edmund thought so highly of Lin Li, his hatred for Lin Li was raised by a few notches because of it too. In his opinion, it was clear enough that if it weren't for Lin Li, Saint Edmund wouldn't have been so austere and harsh to him, even if he had said something callous. However, at this point, Kantori knew that the people present were intending to get closer to Lin Li more likely than not, so he had no choice but to suppress his hatred in the bottom of his heart. He took a few deep breaths, got a grip on his emotions, and turned around to say to Bradler, "Your Majesty, I was just worried that wild whale Rabu would escape again and bring disaster to our kingdom, but I didn't expect that President Flick would misunderstand me. When we return, I'll definitely find an opportunity to explain to President Flick." After hearing Kantori's explanation, Bradler did not seem relieved at all. Instead, he looked at Kantori with great disappointment in his eyes, and said, "Kantori, what you did today was indeed overboard, and done with a lack of consideration. I hope you really know that you were wrong. As for apologizing to President Flick, just do as you wish." As the king of a nation, Bradler was experienced and wise enough to tell that there was actually still no hint of remorse in Kantori's words. In fact, knowing what Kantori was like, Bradler was worried that Kantori might do something that would offend Lin Li even more if he forced Kantori to apologize again. Besides, Bradler could also tell from the fact that Lin Li had ignored Kantori just now that Lin Li simply didn't take Kantori seriously. In that case, it wouldn't matter if Kantori apologized or not. He believed that as long as the Gilded Kingdom could express due sincerity, there would still be a chance to make things right with Lin Li. Seeing the hypocritical look on Kantori's face, Bradler shook his head helplessly, turned around, and flew back towards Four Seasons Island with Prince Monterey and his ministers. Since even Bradler had left, the others naturally did not bother to stay behind anymore. Apart from the curious ones, who wanted to go see the place where Rabu had been suppressed, The rest of the crowd also left the sea. I didn't expect Felix to have hid his abilities so well. Sendros of the Darkness Shrine lamented to his close friend, Inglos. He thought he already knew Lin Li well enough, but he didn't expect to be taken by surprise yet again. After hearing his words, Inglos couldn't help but shake his head and laugh bitterly as he said, "Yes, given how young he is. I'm afraid no one would think that he has made such great accomplishments in the field of inscription, if he didn't say so himself. To be honest, even if he said it himself, I'm afraid the majority of people would not believe it. Well, just look at how those people at the auction reacted when the magic scroll was first put on display on stage." Among the people present, Sendros and Inglos could be considered the ones who were the closest to Lin Li. They had previously crossed paths numerous times in Anral, but they only knew that Lin Li had extremely high attainments in pharmaceutics and were unaware of his remarkable attainments in the field of inscription. The fact that Lin Li could reach the sanctuary realm of magic at such a young age was already extremely incredible in the eyes of most people. Now, it was revealed that he also had attainments that were beyond imaginable in the fields of inscription and pharmaceutics. That made Sendros and Inglos find it hard to believe that Lin Li was really just a human. Of course, it was not too late to find out. Compared to the forces of the endless ocean, who were now feeling anxious and paranoid, Sendros and Inglos felt a lot less complicated. After all, the two of them were far closer to Lin Li than those forces of the endless ocean, so they didn't have to rush to befriend Lin Li. At this moment, Lin Li and Connors had already passed through the spatial rift and returned to the embassy of the Tower of Dusk. However, back in the embassy, Connors also finally found it hard to contain his curiosity about the magic scroll, as he couldn't help but ask Lin Li which level the latter had reached in terms of inscription. After all, Lin Li had never demonstrated the power of the magic scroll in front of Connors and the others ever since he created it, and instead had it sent straight to the auction at the invitation of the Gilded Kingdom. Therefore, Connors also did not expect that the magic scroll actually had the ability to easily suppress an enemy that was a demigod. Back in the land of curses, Lin Li had suffered quite a lot of hardships in order to deal with High Priest Power, who was a demigod. Who would have thought that after such a short period of time, Lin Li would be able to rely on a magic scroll to easily subdue a wild whale that was far stronger than High Priest Power and suppress it at the bottom of the sea. Of course, although Connors was not entirely clueless about inscription, he definitely didn't have any remarkable skills in it. Hence, even if Lin Li explained to him, he wouldn't be able to understand the theories of inscription at all. After probing for a while, he had only learned that the magic scroll had indeed reached a level that was close to the Divine Smith level. However, that answer was sufficient to clear Connors' doubts and also made him even more determined to follow Lin Li, whom he was now even more confident in. Although Connors was once an ancient demon deity, he was still far from the true divine realm. Otherwise, he would not have been reduced to being sealed in a hammer at the end. Stepping into the divine realm and achieving godhood had always been a far-fetched dream for him. Although Lin Li was the one who was reaching the divine realm, it also gave Connors some hope. After all, he was a follower of Lin Li. Since he started being subordinate to Lin Li, his miserable fate had been reversed, and he had gotten out of a hopeless predicament. Not only did he break free from the shackles of the hammer, he had also obtained the perfect body of High Lord Osric, which gave him hope in breaking through to the sanctuary realm. Later on, with the enhancements and repairs that Lin Li made to the perfect body, its potential was greatly raised, and Connors thought that it would be possible for him to become a deity one day. Now, the main reason for Connors' delay in reaching the sanctuary realm was actually the overpowering strength of the perfect body. Bodies could be compared to buckets, and for others, their bucket might be easily filled with water, and once the bucket was full, it would represent the breakthrough to the sanctuary realm. However, Connors' perfect body was like a massive bucket that would take a long time to fill. However, once his bucket was filled, the achievements he would be able to make with his perfect body would definitely be far beyond what ordinary people could measure up to. Moreover, Connors believed that as long as Lin Li was able to reach the divine realm and become a true god, Lin Li would be able to easily solve all problems for Connors even if the latter encountered any issues with his perfect body in the future. By then, Connors would have a greater chance of reaching the divine realm himself. When Connors first signed the contract with Lin Li to become his servant, he was actually more or less compelled into it, and didn't actually do it willingly. However, after seeing the achievements that Lin Li had made so far, he no longer felt indignant. In his current opinion, becoming Lin Li's servant was no longer a choice that he was forced to make because of the circumstances he was in, but a great opportunity. Soon after Lin Li returned to the embassy, one of his men came to report that Saint Edmund, an elder Zoomer of the Illuminati, had come to visit. Lin Li naturally knew the purpose of their visit, so he immediately asked someone to invite them to the living room, while he subsequently made his way there. President Flick, I'm really sorry. I'd like to apologize to you on Cantori's behalf for everything that he has said to you. I'll also tell the Lord to be stricter with Cantori and discipline him. As soon as they met, Saint Edmund first expressed his apologies to Lin Li. After all, Cantori had indeed gone overboard. However, Lin Li was not bothered by it. After asking the two of them to take a seat, he said, "You don't have to apologize. As long as those flies don't fly in front of me, I won't be bothered to care about it. Apart from the apology, what else are you here for this time, Saint Edmund?" Lin Li was not an extremely magnanimous person, but he would sometimes feel that those nobodies weren't worth his time at all. If Cantori had done something that was really significant enough to catch his attention, Lin Li would have probably crushed him to death with a simple lift of his finger. He wouldn't even care who Cantori's master was. Hearing Lin Li's words, Saint Edmund sighed helplessly in his heart, even though he knew that Lin Li didn't care about this matter. In fact, given Lin Li's and Cantori's young age, Saint Edmund would rather they become friends so that he wouldn't have to swallow his pride all the time to beg others for help. In fact, Lin Li wasn't very picky when it came to making friends, and anyone, even an ordinary powerless person, could become his friend as long as they hit it off well. Otherwise, even if they were the Lord of the Illuminati, Lin Li wouldn't take another glance at him. President Flick, judging from that magic scroll, you should have made another major breakthrough in your attainment in the field of inscription, right? I wonder if you're now somewhat certain and confident about the matter I spoke to you about previously, Saint Edmund said as he put aside the regret in his heart and broached the topic regarding the purpose of his visit. The matter that Saint Edmund was referring to was naturally the resurrection of Lord Aquilo, which they had talked about under Cursed Island back then. Since Lin Li had promised to help them, he certainly wouldn't back out now. Hence, he indifferently said, "Oh, so you're referring to that. Let me make things clear. I might have made some breakthroughs in the field of inscription, but I'm still far from the divine smith level, and I can only vaguely grasp the mysteries within." Lin Li was not being modest. Although Mount Tai could suppress wild whale Rabu, it was still far from the immortal king's divine smith level Magath. In fact, Lin Li had only studied a small portion of it, which was probably less than 1%. Hence, even if Lin Li created a Magath that could speed up the resurrection of Aquilo according to Edmund's request, it would still be impossible to really bring Aquilo back to life immediately. However, instead of looking disappointed, Saint Edmund was excited, and said, "No problem, I believe that with your level of attainments in inscription, you'd definitely be able to resurrect Saint Aquilo, at least a few decades earlier than planned. That would be of great help to us." According to his initial estimation, it would take at least nearly a century to resurrect Saint Aquilo, with the power of that holy relic. Although 100 years was nothing for the Illuminati that had already existed for thousands of years, it would naturally be best if they could have that duration. Moreover, the senior members of the Illuminati had all sensed the recent changes that had occurred in Anral. Although they were not sure what would happen to this world in the end, they could vaguely guess that it would definitely be something disastrous. Hence, it was unknown if they still had another 100 years to wait for Saint Aquilo to be resurrected. Edmund was once the follower of Saint Aquilo, and thus had a deep understanding of the latter's strength. He was well aware that it would undoubtedly be of great help to the Illuminati if Saint Aquilo could be resurrected once there were any changes in this world. Hearing Saint Edmund's words, Lin Li nodded, and said, "Since you've said so, I don't mind making a trip there." Saint Edmund, do you still remember the terms that we have agreed on? When Lin Li had promised Edmund, he had once mentioned that he would help on the condition that he could read the Illuminatis' canonical texts. Besides, he didn't want to read the canon that was used to fool others, but the original canon that only the higher-ups of the Illuminati could read, which involved all the secrets of the Illuminati since the beginning of its establishment. Although the original canon of the Illuminati involved much of the dark past of the Illuminati, it wouldn't matter even if Lin Li, an outsider, found out. After all, after being in operation for thousands of years, the faith of the Illuminati believers was strong enough not to be shaken easily. Even if Lin Li was aware of all the sordid things that they had done in the past and began spreading it around, not many believers would be convinced by his words because he was an outsider. Hence, compared to the resurrection of Holy Lord Aquilo, the risk of giving Lin Li their top canon was nothing. Hence, after hearing Lin Li mention that condition again, Saint Edmund grabbed a very ancient-looking book and handed it to Lin Li without hesitation. The ancient-looking book was very thick, and there were probably more than 1,000 pages, making it suitable for being a pillow. The cover was made of white beast hide which had slightly yellowed over the years. There were 2 large words written in gold at the top. Although the book was well preserved, it had been thousands of years, after all, and some traces of wear and tear could be seen clearly on the pages. Besides, Lin Li could also sense that the book contained an extremely strong power of magic. Although it could not be compared to Garesco's Book of Eternity, it was still quite a powerful magic prop that was probably considered a holy artifact in the Illuminati. The Illuminati was willing to take out the original canon because they wanted to prove the authenticity of it and also to express their sincerity. After Lin Li received the canon of the Illuminati, he naturally couldn't look through it seriously in front of Edmund. Hence, he merely flipped through 2 pages casually before placing it on the bedside table and saying to Edmund, "Good, I'll borrow this canon for a few days. Go prepare the materials needed for the creation of the Magath. We'll go to Cursed Island in 3 days." Although Lin Li had left his mental strength seal on Cursed Island that would allow him to travel through space and reach it regardless of how it shifted, there were lots of peculiarities on that island. Even though they had already explored it once, Lin Li felt that what he had explored was hardly beyond 1% of what it contained. Hence, in order to be safe, Lin Li decided to travel there through a conventional method. Otherwise, God knew what kind of consequences opening the spatial rift would lead to. After hearing Lin Li's agreement, Edmund and Zoomer could not help but be pleasantly surprised. After exchanging some pleasantries with Lin Li and settling on the time to leave, they left with a list of materials that Lin Li had casually given them. Soon after Edmund and Zoomer left, Lin Li returned to his room. Less than 15 minutes later, someone came in to report that another person had come to visit. The visitor this time was Grand Duke Viti, who had presided over the auction that had just ended. "President Flick, I'm really sorry. The magic scroll you created was completely beyond our appraisal abilities. That's why I said it was a master-level piece during the auction. I hope to seek your forgiveness. Fortunately, your magic scroll has also fetched a record-breaking price in the history of our auction. Otherwise, I really wouldn't have the cheek to face you," Grand Duke Viti said, apologizing to Lin Li as soon as he saw him. It wasn't that Grand Duke Viti was making a mountain out of a molehill. After all, inscribers often gave others the impression of being arrogant and aloof. Lin Li also showed that he wouldn't let himself suffer any losses after he arrived in the Gilded Kingdom. During the auction, Grand Duke Viti actually called his magic scroll, which could suppress even Wild Whale Rabu, a master-level piece. No inscriber would be able to tolerate that. Besides, the price of 400 million gold coins was not really considered a staggering price for such an incredible magic scroll. If the people had been aware from the start that this magic scroll had the power to suppress such a high-level enemy like Wild Whale Rabu, many people would definitely have vied for it even if the price had been 4 billion gold coins. Hence, after Grand Duke Viti heard about the suppression of Rabu, the joy he derived from the fact that the magic scroll had fetched a record-breaking price at the auction immediately vanished. Instead, he broke out in a cold sweat. Besides, he was very certain that he would become a laughingstock because of the price of the magic scroll, which he was initially very proud of after the incident that happened today was spread to the public. Well, it was an item that was worth billions of gold coins, and yet it was sold for only 400 million gold coins. That was obviously an absolute joke. If others wanted to make a joke out of this, they could do so all they wanted as far as the Grand Duke was concerned. However, Grand Duke Viti did not dare to pretend that nothing had happened in front of Lin Li. Besides, Bradler had given Grand Duke Viti a harsh scolding when he'd summoned him previously, with no regards to the fact that he was the cash cow of the royals. Viti could also sense that Bradler was truly infuriated. Hence, while wiping the spit that Bradler had rained on his face, Grand Duke Viti urged the staff of the auction to rush to the embassy of the Tower of Dusk to apologize. Although the price of the magic scroll was considered low, Lin Li didn't take the scroll to the auction for the sake of getting some gold coins. In fact, he was even ready to see the magic scroll being auctioned off at a price of tens of thousands of gold coins. Besides, Grand Duke Viti was right. Given the current standards of ordinary inscribers, it was basically impossible to identify the level of the magic scroll. Hence, Lin Li didn't blame Grand Duke Viti. After hearing Grand Duke Viti's apology, Lin Li merely smiled calmly and pointed at the chair beside him. He said, "Grand Duke Viti, please have a seat. I put that magic scroll up for auction only because King Bradler had asked me to. If I'd really intended to exchange it for money, I could have found someone to bid for it with a higher price. So, you don't have to hold it against yourself." Seeing that Lin Li was speaking calmly and didn't seem to have blamed him, Grand Duke Viti secretly sighed with relief. He then took out a crystal card and handed it to Lin Li with both hands with some guilt on his face while saying, "President Flick, no matter what, we've indeed made a mistake during the auction. This crystal card contains 400 million gold coins, which is the proceeds from the auction, and an additional 100 million gold coins, which is a form of compensation from us. Although this is far from being enough for compensating for your losses, this is as much as we can withdraw now. If you'd like, you may take a look at the treasures that we have in our treasure vault. We're willing to compensate you with those collection items. Logically speaking, when an item was successfully auctioned at the auction, a portion of gold coins would have to be deducted from the sales proceeds as commission to be paid to the auctioneer. According to the commission percentage, the auction house would supposedly have raked in tens of millions of gold coins from the auction of the magic scroll. However, no matter how thick-skinned Grand Duke Vidi was, he couldn't bring himself to charge Lin Li any commission fees after having made such a grave mistake. After all, that magic scroll would have definitely fetched a staggering price of billions of gold coins if it had been sold during a public auction. This time, it had really been sold at a price that was way below its value. However, the auction house would not be able to afford to take out billions of gold coins to compensate for Lin Li's loss, even if the Gilded Kingdom emptied their treasury. Grand Duke Vidi could only afford to fork out 100 million gold coins as a token of apology to Lin Li. He hoped that he could seek Lin Li's understanding, and even offered to further compensate him with the items of the auction house. The auction items that could be used as finale items would not appear at the auction of every single sea market. Hence, the auction house would usually put away some precious treasures and keep them in their collection in order to prepare for the situation where there were no items worthy of being a finale item. Over the past several thousand years, they had definitely accumulated quite a considerable collection of treasures, which were about as valuable as items that could be used for the finale pieces of their auctions. Lin Li no longer stood on ceremony and took the crystal card. He said, "Okay then, I will accept this crystal card, but I don't see the need to take an item from your collection. However, there's indeed something on my agenda that I haven't done yet." Grand Duke Vidi thought that the matter would be over after he saw Lin Li accepting the crystal card, but he didn't expect that Lin Li would reject his suggestion for Lin Li to take something from the auction item collection. He could tell that Lin Li probably had some other request, which made him really nervous, for he was afraid that Lin Li would raise some conditions that the Gilded Kingdom could not accept. However, it was impossible for him to turn Lin Li down. Grand Duke Vidi came here this time by order of King Bradler, who demanded that the former try to improve the relationship between the kingdom and Lin Li at all costs. Even though Vidi was well aware that Bradler wasn't really going to ignore whatever consequences there might be, he still had to hear what Lin Li's request was. Thinking of this, Grand Duke Vidi seemed to be caught in a dilemma, and he cautiously asked Lin Li, "President Flick, what do you have on your agenda? Please feel free to let me know if there is something that requires the Gilded Kingdom's help. We will definitely help you as long as it's within our means." Grand Duke Vidi was very conscientious, and had deliberately brought up the Gilded Kingdom in his answer. Only the authorities of the Gilded Kingdom would know if it was within their means. In other words, if Lin Li's request was beyond the expectations of the Gilded Kingdom, they could use the excuse of being incapable of meeting it. However, Lin Li didn't take Grand Duke Vidi's intentions to heart, and simply nodded in acknowledgement, as if he couldn't tell what Grand Duke Vidi meant. He then said, "Apart from the fact that I had been invited by the Gilded Kingdom, another reason that I'm here is mainly to purchase a batch of ship cannons. I'm sure the Gilded Kingdom is capable of selling the cannons to me. Also, please rest assured that I will pay as much as the cannons cost. I won't take advantage and shortchange you." Purchase cannons. Grand Duke Vidi was aware that the Tower of Dusk had previously bought ship cannons from the Gilded Kingdom, and that the Gilded Kingdom had deliberately caused a huge delay in the order's fulfillment back then. However, at that time, the Gilded Kingdom regarded the Tower of Dusk as an enemy that would hamper their development in the breezy plains. Hence, they naturally hadn't agreed to the deal resolutely. However, things were different now. When Grand Duke Vidi arrived, he heard King Bradler say that he wanted to form good relations with Lin Li, a guru of inscription, at all costs. In that case, selling some ship cannons to the Tower of Dusk was not quite big of a deal. Hence, Grand Duke Vidi once again sighed in relief after hearing that those were the only conditions Lin Li needed him to fulfill. Even if they had to give Lin Li a batch of ship cannons free of charge in exchange for the chance to get closer to Lin Li, who was a guru of inscription, the Gilded Kingdom would definitely be able to accept it. Besides, Lin Li had just said that he would be paying for it. Of course, even if this request was nothing to the Gilded Kingdom, Grand Duke Vidi could not really say it out loud. Instead, he thought about it while looking rather conflicted before answering, "President Flick, it's actually not difficult for the Gilded Kingdom to sell some cannons to you, but the manufacturing process for the cannons is quite difficult, and even our fleet has only a small number of cannons in reserve." "President Flick, how many magic crystal cannons would you like to buy?" Grand Duke Vidi was afraid that Lin Li would ask for too much, so he told Lin Li of his side's difficulties. It wasn't that he didn't want to sell the magical crystal cannons to Lin Li, but rather that the Gilded Kingdom didn't have many in reserve for their own use, either. In his opinion, Lin Li wouldn't make the Gilded Kingdom sell him all the magical crystal cannons they had, regardless of how thick-skinned he might be. After hearing that, Lin Li smiled and gently touched the ring of endless storm that he was wearing with his fingers. He said, Grand Duke Viti, don't worry. I also heard from Elder Zoomer and the others that the magical crystal cannons are quite difficult to transport due to their massive size. Hence, I've already discussed it with them, and they said that they would sell me as many as I can transport. Grand Duke Viti was completely relieved to hear that. The magical crystal cannons were usually used as the main weapon on the Gilded Kingdom's giant alchemical battleships. Hence, they were naturally much larger than ordinary ship cannons and bastas. It could be said that Elder Zoomer wasn't wrong when he said that even the largest cargo ships could transport at most only 3 to 4 magical crystal cannons at a time. Although Grand Duke Viti had seen the star before and knew that it could be called the largest of all battleships, it was the only battleship that the Tower of Dusk had. Even if they took up every inch of space in the ship, how many magical crystal cannons could it fit? Of course, the Tower of Dusk could also spend money to charter some cargo ships, but even if they chartered 100 large cargo ships, they could at most transport a little more than 300 magical crystal cannons at a time. The Gilded Kingdom did have a little more than 300 magical crystal cannons to spare. Besides, Lin Li might not necessarily be able to find more than 100 large cargo ships to transport the cannons. President Flick, you're right. The magical crystal cannons are large, and ordinary cargo ships can at most fit 2 each, while the largest ones can fit 3 or 4. When you were in the breezy plains, the logistics issues had indeed made the transaction very troublesome. President Flick, why don't you let me know how many magical crystal cannons you intend to purchase? If the transportation is inconvenient for you, we can provide you with some help. Grand Duke Viti knew that Lin Li couldn't transport that many magical crystal cannons at once, so he generously offered to help. Of course, there was still a limit as to the help they could give Lin Li, and it mainly depended on how many Lin Li actually wanted to purchase. I'll buy as many as I can fit in my storage space. Grand Duke Viti, you don't have a problem with that, do you? Of course, Lin Li wasn't going to reveal the number of magical crystal cannons that he intended to buy. God knew how many the Gilded Kingdom had in stock. Given the enormous capacity of the Ring of Endless Storm, he would have no problem loading all the battleships of the Gilded Kingdom into it, let alone just some magical crystal cannons. Grand Duke Viti would never be able to guess that Lin Li had an incredible item like the Ring of Endless Storm, and he merely instinctively felt that something was wrong, though he couldn't put a finger on it. He simply thought that he had been reading too much into it, and thus nodded resolutely. All right, in that case, I will not persuade you further. You may come to me when it's convenient for you. I'll take you to collect those magical crystal cannons. Although they had only come to a verbal agreement, without writing the terms down in the form of a contract, Lin Li believed that the Gilded Kingdom would not go back on their word and back out. After all, their attitude was clear. Lin Li could tell that they were obviously trying to butter him up. Besides, once the magical crystal cannons were loaded into the Ring of Endless Storm, it wouldn't be easy to make Lin Li take them out again. In this case, even if Lin Li took away all the magical crystal cannons, they would have no choice but to suck it up and accept it. After agreeing on the matter of the magical crystal cannons, and a simple exchange of words, Grand Duke Viti stood up with a gleeful expression and bade farewell to Lin Li. In his opinion, since he had made up for his mistake at the auction and reached an agreement with Lin Li regarding the magical crystal cannons, he should have completed the task that King Bradler had given him. After sending Grand Duke Viti away, they received several batches of guests again in the embassy of the Tower of Dusk. Lin Li was familiar with some of them, such as Sendros, Inglos, Prince Jeremiah, and Prince Jonathan, as well as the representatives of the forces of the Breezy Plains. There were also some whom Lin Li wasn't familiar with, such as Elder Ronald of the Jellyfish Clan, and Prince Manson of the Thunder Eel Clan, both of whom were from forces of the Endless Ocean. Lin Li was not an unfriendly person, so he welcomed his visitors smilingly without putting on airs, unlike most inscribers who were often lofty and arrogant. That made the visitors, especially those who had not known Lin Li prior to this, have a good impression of him. After all, what they originally heard about Lin Li were his notorious acts of brutally putting the Gilded Kingdom to shame, which made them think that Lin Li was ill-tempered and difficult to get along with. However, after this brief interaction, they felt that Lin Li was completely different from what the stories and rumors made him out to be. In fact, Lin Li was the type to treat those who respected him with even greater respect. He would never put on airs in front of those who expressed goodwill to him, even though he was powerful enough to just disregard them. As for those who liked provoking him and inviting trouble, Lin Li would never mind using some ruthless means to teach them a lesson. Lin Li spent 3 days receiving guests and seeing them off over and over again. The magic scroll that could suppress wild whale Rabu had allowed Lin Li to rise to great fame in the Gilded Kingdom. Besides, due to the fact that the sea market was open during this period of time, the forces of various sizes from the endless ocean, and even the entire Anral, were gathered there. After the sea market ended, Lin Li would conceivably become a household name in Anral. 3 days later, Saint Edmund and Elder Zoomer came to the embassy of the Tower of Dusk again to inform Lin Li that they had made all the preparations and were ready to set off to the Cursed Island again. Since he had already agreed, Lin Li didn't find any excuse to procrastinate, and instead first checked the inscription materials that Saint Edmund had brought over. The Illuminati had been in operation for thousands of years, so they naturally had plenty of good items in their collection. Besides, the sea market was being held during this period of time, so even if they lacked something, they could find it easily at the sea market. Besides, the quality of these inscription materials could be considered the best, and they even included 2 full bottles of magical ink produced by the Octopus clan, which was condensed with the power of the Octopus clan's bloodline. It was just as important as blood was to a human. Generally, it would be difficult to purchase such magical ink at the sea market, not to mention one that contained the magical wave of the sanctuary realm. After checking, Lin Li found that the inscription materials were to his satisfaction, and there was nothing wrong with the processing, either. Thus, he said to Saint Edmund, "These things are not too bad. There aren't any problems with them. We can set off now." Saint Edmund couldn't help but be nervous when Lin Li was checking the materials. After all, he did not have high attainments in the field of inscription, like Lin Li did, so he didn't know whether the things he had prepared were suitable for use or not. However, when he saw Lin Li nodding, he finally heaved a sigh of relief and suppressed the joy within him, before calmly saying, "President Flick, we are relieved to hear that there are no issues with the materials." After some discussion, they decided to travel to the Cursed Island by boat. With the sanctuary-level power of Lin Li, Edmund, and the others, it would be much faster to fly there directly, but they hadn't explored the island fully, and so no one knew if there were really no more powerful enemies there. Although Lin Li did not care about the depletion of mana, because he had a massive amount of mana, not everyone was as powerful as him. If they all flew there directly, and ran into opponents that were at the peak of the sanctuary realm, such as the twin serpents of light and darkness, they would be in huge trouble. Of course, there was no need for them to split up and go there in separate vessels this time, because with the star around, Lin Li could just have the Illuminatus team on board with him as he made his way there. In addition to the sanctuary powerhouses Edmund and Zoomer, Priest Richard of the Chaos Sanctuary was also part of the Illuminatus team. Richard could be considered the direct subordinate of Saint Edmund, and his strength was at the peak of the legendary realm. This time, the Illuminatus team was not as large as the one that headed to the island the other time. Although there were only 40-odd members, they all had legendary level strength. On the other hand, Lin Li told Norfaler and Ufalusi to stay behind, and took Conorus, Angelano, as well as the mages of the Mage Legion with him instead. Ufalusi was still working on the Ice Phoenix's corpse, while Norfaler was secretly watching the auction's vicinity for the Bellerophon's coral staff. However, even without these 2 undead servants, Lin Li still had great combat power. Although Conorus was still a tiny step away from the sanctuary realm, he would have no problem dealing with ordinary sanctuary powerhouses. Meanwhile, Angelano's alchemy colossus was now equipped with the divine sea pillar, which gave him a considerable increase in strength even when he was in the sea. As for the mages, they were all legendary mages, who were on par with, if not stronger than, the Illuminatus team. Soon, the massive sea fortress, the Star, once again set sail away from Helena Port, and sailed at full speed towards the waters around the Cursed Island. Since Lin Li had left his mental strength seal there, he wasn't afraid that he would lose track of the island as it drifted around this time. After over 10 days, they arrived at the island again. After stepping onto the island, both teams started rushing to complete their goal without further delay. Along the way, they indeed had previously encountered the interference of some magical beasts, but those magical beasts were simply courting death by attacking them. In fact, the only thing that gave them trouble the last time they were there was the Ice Phoenix. It only took both the teams half a day to reach the massive bottomless crypt in the center of the ice island. Just like the other time they were there, the mages and Lin Li's team took out their magic wings. However, Lin Li did not ignore the Illuminatus team this time, and even gave Saint Edmund a batch of magic wings. With this batch of magic wings, the Illuminati was no longer as disheveled as they had been when they landed in the crypt previously. However, even so, The two teams took a few days to reach the bottom from the top. After all, the crypt had a huge depth, and even if they were free-falling, it would take some time to reach the bottom. Besides, they had to deliberately control the speed of descent. The first thing that the teams saw was the gilded palace, in the middle, which resembled the sun, but this time, it was no longer blocked by the light-winged angels. The rays of light were just a little dazzling. After entering the palace, groups of abyssal demons began to appear one after another. Perhaps they hadn't wiped out all of the demons the previous time, or there was something in the palace that could summon demons from the endless abyss. However, regardless of what kind of abyssal demons they were, they wouldn't pose a threat to the two teams. The teams simply bulldozed through, leaving behind the flesh of demons all over the ground. However, they entered the palace quietly. As for the magic gears and magic traps in the palace, Angelano had already cracked them and opened up a path for them, so they wouldn't hamper the team's progress. It was almost a smooth way, and the two teams arrived at the crypt that was deep in the palace. They once again looked for the rift that had once been guarded by a titan before passing through the ruins of the ancient city, and finally entered the well-lit desert. Upon arriving, the teams finally slowed down. Under Lin Li and Saint Edmund's orders, they got on standby and continued advancing towards the desert. They were well aware that even if they came to explore once more, they wouldn't be able to get rid of all the magical beasts here. There were even abyssal demons that seemed infinite in number in the palace. Sure enough, as the two teams delved deeper, the poisonous scorpions of the large desert began to appear continuously. They would usually hide in the sand and conceal their magical waves. When there was prey passing by, they would emerge and attack their prey. Perhaps because the incarnation of the Serpent of Light, which used to occupy the desert, was no longer around, the number of desert scorpions alone was more than 10 times greater than the last time the two factions had been there. If they let their guard down just because they had explored it once, they would really have to pay a huge price for it. LL New Street Rise at N0V, LB, CM. However, the good thing was that the poisonous desert scorpions were the only ones there, and terrifying existences like the incarnation of the Serpent of Light no longer appeared. Saint Edmund and Zoomer only knew that the radiant-winged giant python was a sanctuary-level magical beast of the desert, so they were secretly thankful for their good luck. Lin Li naturally knew that the incarnations of the twin serpents of light and darkness were used by the true deities to stabilize their divine kingdoms, and were much rarer in this world than any ancient magical beast or prehistoric mutant magical beasts. Previously, the incarnation of the Serpent of Light had managed to survive in the power of the light radiated from the ancient god of light only by chance. It was impossible for a second one to appear. Along the way, the teams killed lots of desert magical beasts, and finally arrived at the 7 spiked monuments. Under the suppression of the monuments, the ancient god of light seemed to have detected their presence, and once again began moving. However, this time, Edmund and his team had already made their preparations, and High Priest Power didn't tag along this time. When Lin Li saw that the ancient god of light wanted to create trouble again, he immediately secretly made several magical gestures, after which dazzling rays of light emerged from the monuments. Immediately afterwards, whips made of condensed light were flung hard towards the mass of light in the middle of the monuments. Although they couldn't hear anything, the people outside could guess the immense pain and misery of being lashed by the light whips. The members of the Illuminati who had followed Edmund over were the core members of the Chaos Sanctuary, and seemed to have been alerted previously. Hence, when they saw the ancient god of light, that the Illuminati believed in being suppressed and abused, they did not say anything, even though they were clearly astonished. This time, their purpose was not to attack the ancient god of light, so they didn't stay there for long. After leaving the 7 monuments, the teams continued to proceed deeper into the desert, soon finding their way to the temple where the founding saint, Lord Aquilo, was at. The Mage Legion of the Tower of Dusk and the Illuminatus team were made to stay on guard outside the temple. The experience they had when they had arrived allowed them to learn that even though it was their second time here, this place was still full of uncertainty and danger. Saint Edmund didn't want to see the Mageth that Lin Li created slip up at such a critical moment. Lin Li walked alone into the crumbling temple, and arrived at the center where Aquila was. At this moment, Aquila looked largely similar to the way he did before they left previously. After all, only a few days had passed. The Illuminatus holy artifact, the Eye of Light, which was on Aquilo's body, was now emitting a faint glow that was engulfing Aquilo's body. It could be seen that although the power of the Eye of Light was constantly repairing Aquilo's body, it was doing so at an extremely slow speed. At such a slow rate of recovery, Aquilo's body would at least take 100-odd years to be healed completely, and even longer for resurrection and his mobility to be restored. Lin Li observed the surroundings, and then waved his hand forward, after which several human-sized tornadoes appeared in space. The small tornadoes revolved around Aquilo's body, and cleared away the surrounding debris on the ground in the blink of an eye. Not only did the small tornadoes clean up the mess on the ground, they even polished the ground. Apart from where Aquila was seated, the surrounding ground simply seemed to be as smooth and flat as a mirror. After all, the Magheth that Lin Li created this time would be near the divine smith level. Even with his current attainments in the field of inscription, it was impossible for him to draw a Magheth of such a high level as easily as he would an elementary Magheth. Therefore, first of all, he needed a flat plane that would not affect the Magheth in any way. After the small tornadoes dissipated, Lin Li took out the inscription materials prepared by the Illuminati. Although the materials had already been processed, he had to mix them further in order for them to be used for creating the Magheth. As with the mixing of colors for paintings, the creation of Magheths required the consideration of every single magic circuit, Magheth symbol, and their corresponding effects on the Magheth in order to deduce the type of materials that were required to be matched with them. Of course, after the research Lin Li had done on the divine smith level Magheth, he now had a good idea of how to mix and match the materials without having to spend too much time on calculations. After putting all the arranged materials in place, he immediately started to prepare the special ink for the drawing of the Magheth. The basis of this special ink was naturally the sanctuary level octopus ink, which was probably second to none in the entire Anral. Lin Li divided the 2 bottles of ink into 24 portions, each of which had to be mixed with a special combination of materials. If Lin Li was a divine smith inscriber, he naturally wouldn't have to go through such trouble, as he would be able to turn even the most common ink into the right ink as he wished. However, Lin Li had to adopt such a somewhat tedious approach in order to draw a Magheth that was close to the divine smith level. After dividing the ink, Lin Li immediately began to quickly prepare the ink. He added various materials to the octopus clan's ink in various doses. As he moved, the ink too gradually began to emit unique magical waves and various colorful magical lights. It took more than an hour for Lin Li to finally finish concocting 24 different types of ink. Of course, to ordinary inscribers, his speed could be considered incredible and godly. The preparation of inscription ink was similar to the concoction of potions, as both processes involved the mixing of a variety of properties belonging to the materials and a careful control of the timing and technique. However, when Lin Li was preparing them, he seemed to have done it without taking a second look at what he was mixing. He seemed to be doing it with greater ease than a bartender mixing a cocktail. After preparing the ink, Lin Li began to officially draw the Magheth. He gently dipped the crystal pen in one of the portions of ink, and the bright red liquid was immediately sucked into the cavity of the pen. Lin Li then continuously flashed past Aquilo and around him like a phantom, while various Magheth patterns and magic symbols appeared on the flat and smooth ground. The Magheth that Lin Li was now going to create was, strictly speaking, already considered a demigod level Magheth, as it seemed to be a little beyond the guru level, but below the divine smith level. However, simply in terms of complexity alone, this Magheth was of a much higher level than the divine smith level Magheth. After all, Lin Li had yet to become a divine smith, so even if he was trying to use his guru level knowledge of Magheths to explain divine smith level laws, he would need to have a large amount of information. That was the difference between the guru level and divine smith level, which was tantamount to using a huge quantitative change to explain a qualitative change. What Lin Li drew was not just a simple Magheth, but one that was created by using a large amount of inscription knowledge to analyze the laws of the divine smith level. If a highly competent guru of inscription were to come over, he would definitely be able to comprehend plenty of rare inscription knowledge from the Magheths. As Lin Li drew, a huge and complex Magheth began to gradually take shape on the ground. It was actually a Magheth array made up of 24 Magheths, but unlike the all-kill array of the Tower of Dusk, the 24 Magheths were completely different from each other. Drawing a Magheth array was not as simple as drawing more than 10 Magheths and putting them together. Such a simple method would not form an array. Drawing a Magheth array required the consideration of the influence that one Magheth would have on the other Magheths that it was put together with and vice versa, as well as the connection between Magheths. Hence, in Anral, inscribers were rare, and masters of inscription were even rarer, while masters of inscription who could draw Magheth arrays were few and far between. When the Tower of Dusk had been established, the inscriber of the Supreme Council, Moke, who had drawn the Magheths for the Tower of Dusk, had been greatly frightened by Lin Li's all-kill array, which was actually just a simple Magheth array. Magheth arrays were rare because of the high difficulty of drawing. The first Magheth to be drawn was naturally just an ordinary Magheth that could be drawn easily, but when drawing the second, one would have to consider its influence on the first Magheth. Likewise, when drawing the third, one would have to consider its influence on the first and second Magheths, and so on. Thus, it could be said that every time a Magheth was added to the Magheth array, the difficulty of drawing another Mageth and expanding the array further would rise exponentially compared to drawing the one preceding it. The all-kill array of the Tower of Dusk was just a Mageth array composed of 10 Mageths, but it was already enough to shock Moke, the inscriber of the Supreme Council, to the point of being speechless. What Lin Li was going to draw now, however, was a Mageth array composed of 24 Mageths, whose difficulty level could be considered to be beyond the level of mortals. Even with his peak guru level attainments and inscription, Lin Li couldn't help but start slowing down after drawing 10 Mageths. Compared to the all-kill array, the Mageth array he was drawing now not only had a much larger number of Mageths, the level of each Mageth was also far higher than with those of the all-kill array. After all, what he was trying to do now was to surpass the level of mortals like himself, and try to touch the level of the Divine Smith. He also wanted to steal some of the power of the deities through the Divine Smith level. At this critical moment, Edmund and Zoomer, who were already sanctuary powerhouses, couldn't help but feel anxious and apprehensive as they stood outside the wrecked temple. If they hadn't been worried about disturbing Lin Li, Edmund and Zoomer would have really charged inside immediately and watched Lin Li complete the Mageth with their very own eyes. Especially with the passage of time, some visions gradually appeared in the nearby space, and the magical elements began to fluctuate vigorously. A large amount of elements of light began surging towards the temple. In the beginning, the elements of light were surging rather slowly like a mild breeze, but they gradually seemed to become a light wind, which subsequently escalated to wind that surged from all directions and picked up speed. The visions made Edmund and Zoomer feel even more troubled. They continuously craned their necks and looked inside the temple. Although they could not see anything, they couldn't control their thoughts and kept looking over as if it was the only thing that would put them at ease, only to be disappointed. However, by the time the elements of light were almost surging like a gale, there was a sudden movement coming from the temple, which finally attracted the attention of Saint Edmund and Zoomer. Immediately afterwards, a group of extremely strange-looking creatures began dashing over from an area that they hadn't explored previously. Each of the creatures had an upper body that was similar to humans and a lower body that resembled a big, fat worm, as well as arms that were like the size of praying mantises. Although they didn't have legs and could only move forward by wriggling their bodies, they were not any slower than other beasts. Instead, each of them had legendary level power. Even Saint Edmund couldn't identify what creatures they were, though he knew that they definitely had hostile intentions. Hence, he immediately instructed his team to get into battle formation. The mages of the Tower of Dusk didn't relax at all since they arrived. After all, the one who had been drawing the Mageth was their president, Lin Li. Hence, after seeing the monsters, the mages barely reacted and were completely unaffected by the monsters' appearance. They were behaving the same as they did when facing human enemies. The humanoid worms were like knights that were about to charge as they dashed towards the Illuminatus and Tower of Dusk's team without showing any signs of stopping. At the same time, their pairs of scythe-like farms swung out in unison towards the two teams, shooting out blades immediately. However, an attack of such a level was simply insignificant to the Illuminati and the Tower of Dusk. Not to mention sanctuary powerhouses like Edmund and Zoomer, even their teams wouldn't be hurt by it. Firstly, the mages of the Tower of Dusk raised their magic staffs in unison, after which a thick ice wall that was several meters high instantly appeared in front of the two teams, blocking the wind blade attacks of the humanoid worms. Next, the mages in the second row also raised their staffs while chanting a few short magic incantations. In an instant, numerous basin-sized fireballs fell from the sky like a meteor shower before blasting at the humanoid worms. Logically speaking, the humanoid worms should have something to fall back on since they had come charging so aggressively. After the mages of the Mage Legion cast their magic spells, they didn't expect it to cause much damage to the humanoid worms. However, to their surprise, when the fireballs landed on the humanoid worms, they lit all 100 odd of them afire like sparks touching a pot of hot oil. Even those that didn't get struck by the fireballs failed to escape. Dumbstruck, both teams looked in front of them, only to see that the humanoid worms were all engulfed by flames and struggling vigorously, looking like moving torches. In just a few minutes, the group of humanoid worms fell silent, and the flames went out, revealing numerous piles of charred ash. What exactly are these things? How dare they charge at us when they're so pathetically weak? Khan Oris was in disbelief as he'd initially thought that he could have the chance to have a good fight, but he hadn't expected it to end just like that. On the other hand, Edmund and Elder Zoomer, too, felt that there was something strange about the situation, even though they were relieved that the battle had ended very quickly. After all, they had just faced hundreds of legendary powerhouses. Even if they were just legendary level magical beasts, the two teams shouldn't have been able to defeat them so easily. However, Immediately afterwards, an even larger group of humanoid worms emerged from the same place that the previous one had come out of. Unlike the previous group, the newly emerged humanoid worms were all lined up neatly in formation like a standard military squad. Among them, there were a few that were much larger and stronger than the rest, and seemed to be the leaders. Seeing that more enemies had appeared, the mages of the Tower of Dusk raised their staffs and launched several attack spells before the worms could come close. Just like before, they launched countless fireballs that blasted at the humanoid worms, almost enveloping all of them within the range of attack. However, this time, those fireballs didn't set the humanoid worms aflame as easily as they'd managed to the previous time. This time, the aftershock of the explosions had merely affected the battle formation of some humanoid worms, and while those that had been struck by the fireballs did sustain injuries, they were not fatal. The sparks that splattered onto the other humanoid worms immediately bounced off them and landed on the ground. The mages didn't achieve the same battle results as before. They're humanoid worms all the same, just a different batch. Yet, they've developed immunity to the damage done by fire elemental magic. Saint Edmund and the others all found it incredible, but the circumstances left them with no chance to carefully search for answers. The humanoid worms squad had already rushed in front of the two teams while resisting the attack spells. At this point, there was no time for bewilderment. The teams of the Illuminati and the Tower of Dusk immediately began fighting the humanoid worms intensely. Although the two teams were taken aback by the humanoid worms' immunity to fire elemental magic spells, they soon discovered that ice elemental magic would do extremely high damage to the humanoid worms too, as if they had zero immunity to ice elemental magic. Hence, shortly after the intense battle began, the Illuminatus and Tower of Dusk's team were the only ones left standing, while the humanoid worms had all turned into corpses with badly mangled flesh that was covered in broken ice bits. Before the members of both teams could catch their breath, another group of humanoid worms came charging over again from the same direction as just now. Having gained some experience, the mages of the Tower of Dusk did not launch meteor-like fireballs at the humanoid worms, and instead chose to launch frozen orbs that revolved and scattered icicles incessantly. However, the humanoid worms this time turned out to have become immune to ice element magic spells again. The frozen orbs were already a legendary level advanced offensive spell, yet it failed to cause much damage to the humanoid worms. The mages then recast the fireballs, but just like before, they didn't manage to cause serious damage to the humanoid worms. At this point, Edmund and others seemed to have made a conjecture that the humanoid worms had the ability to learn from experience and physically evolve to adapt. The first batch of humanoid worms that appeared had zero immunity to fire elemental magic spells, but the second batch had it. However, the second batch proved to be susceptible to ice elemental magic spells. Yet, the third batch was immune to both fire and ice elemental magic spells. They reckoned that it probably wasn't a coincidence. Indeed, just as Edmund and the others had guessed, as each batch of humanoid worms emerged and got annihilated, the difficulty of destroying each of the subsequent batches became higher than with the one preceding it. At last, the batch of humanoid worms that appeared in front of them looked drastically different from the first batch of humanoid worms. The bodies of the humanoid worms were initially cream-colored, but they had now become colorful and were donning hard armor. The armor had not only provided high immunity to various types of magic, it also strengthened their physical defense. At this moment, the teams of the Illuminati and the Tower of Dusk didn't fight with as much ease as before. While the attack spells had caused some damage to the humanoid worms, whose level of immunity against magic was still limited after all, the results were worlds apart from those of the first battle. Some of the members of the Illuminatus team were legendary level sword sages, and their attacks were the cause of the newly added armor on the humanoid worms' bodies. However, if the humanoid worms were struck in their fatal spots, they still wouldn't be able to escape death. However, the battle was much more arduous and difficult than before. After all, the humanoid worms were all at the legendary level and above. The leaders who had larger bodies had even reached the mid-legendary level. Some general-level humanoid worms that had already reached the sanctuary realm also appeared. The humanoid worms managed to evolve so drastically within the short span of just a few hours. Edmund and the others couldn't believe what they were seeing at all. Even the powerful magical beasts had gone through more than 10,000 years of evolution to become as strong as they were now. Yet the humanoid worms managed to shorten the evolutionary process to just a few hours, which simply seemed unrealistic. However, the truth was that the weaklings that they had fought just a few hours ago had now gained a massive spurt in their strength, as if they were on steroids. The mages of the Tower of Dusk had it slightly easier because they were using the magic net array to resist against the attacks, but the Illuminatus team was in a much more wretched state. Connorus was the most excited one in this situation because he thought that a battle would be meaningful only if it was challenging enough. He felt that the one-sided battles that they had fought just now were a complete waste of time and effort. Instead of using the Eternal Frost Blade, he swung his fists and charged towards the humanoid worms. He then began fighting them using the most basic martial arts techniques that warriors mastered, such as punches and kicks. However, Saint Edmund and Elder Zoomer didn't join the battle. Instead, they kept a close watch on the crumbling temple for fear that someone or something might barge in and disturb Lin Li. Moreover, they had already seen a noticeable change in the surrounding space during the battle. Clearly, Lin Li had reached the critical point of drawing the Mage. At this moment, the elements of light in the space had formed several rivers of light that gushed into the depths of the temple from all directions. Under the influence of the light, the brightly lit space had also become much dimmer. The spot where the ancient god of light was being suppressed wasn't too bad, but the spot where the humanoid worms were emerging from had become so dark that it looked like it was almost dusk. Due to the fact that the ancient god of light was suppressed there, the entire space was filled with light that came from the ubiquitous elements of light, so much so that every single corner was well lit. In fact, the people who came here were all enveloped in light too, so none of them had shadows. However, with Lin Li's progress in drawing the Mage, a large number of elements of light gathered in the temple. There wasn't a sun in this space, and since the elements of light had been attracted to the temple, the areas where elements of light were scarce naturally became dimmer too. After a large number of elements of magic were gathered in the temple where Aquila was located, it no longer looked as worn down as before, as the entire temple was shrouded in a bright and dazzling light, creating an extremely sacred atmosphere. Hence, only two spots in this space were left shining brightly, one being the place where the ancient god of light was being suppressed by the 7 monuments, and the other the crumbling temple that was absorbing a large number of elements of light. When the elements of light in the space were absorbed to a certain extent, a few of the rivers of light hanging above the temple also became sparser. Only the river of light that came out of the ancient god of light was still as bright as before. It seemed as if a chain of light had connected the ancient god of light to this temple. That situation had once again caused the ancient god of light to struggle. No one was willing to become someone else's mana source, let alone the ancient god of light that used to be almost invincible. However, the 7 monuments that the immortal king had left behind thoroughly suppressed the ancient god of light. Regardless of how the ancient god of light struggled, it couldn't shake them at all. The ancient god of light's reaction was somewhat similar to that of the humanoid worms that had appeared out of nowhere. It seemed that the large depletion of elements of light had brought about a considerable impact on the humanoid worms, causing them to turn berserk. Before they disappeared, another batch of humanoid worms emerged from the direction that they came from. There was even a massive body that resembled a hill at their back. After the numerous evolutions, the humanoid worms had already displayed considerable strength in battle against the two teams. Yet, more appeared now, and there was even one that seemed to be the boss of the humanoid worms, making Edmund and the others tense up. The massive humanoid worm at the back seemed somewhat similar to the ones that had first appeared. It had a giant-like upper body and a white fat fleshy lower body that resembled a worm. However, there was still a difference between this one and the rest. It had 8 pairs of enormous eyes that were neatly arranged in 2 rows, an extremely unsettling sight. This big guy is mine. Connorus had long gotten sick of fighting against the ordinary humanoid worms, because that was no longer satisfying for him. Although all the other humanoid worms had already evolved, their capabilities and strength were far inferior. Despite being a former ancient demon deity who had once mastered deceit and conspiracy, Connorus chose to fight with brute force, like a barbarian this time, because he wanted to break through to the sanctuary realm through the battle as soon as possible, and not just to satisfy his sadistic desire to kill. However, the ordinary humanoid worms could barely provide much help to him. Instead, it was the boss-level figure that had enticed him. The mana fluctuations around the massive humanoid worm had already reached the sanctuary level, or the middle of it. For Connorus, he was the perfect opponent that could really hone his skills and catalyze the fusion of the perfect body with himself. After greeting Edmund and the others, Connorus waved his hand and summoned the Eternal Frost Blade, after which his body darted out from the battling group and charged towards the massive humanoid worm. Angelano, who had been hiding at the back of the group, began to lose his composure when he saw the humanoid worms surging over like a tidal wave. He was terrified of death, and the reason he tagged along this time was that he didn't think it would be dangerous, because he had already had prior experience. However, given the current situation, Angelano felt a lot less confident. He even regretted tagging along with Lin Li, but there was no time to regret now, and he knew very well that the more important thing was to keep himself safe. By the time the humanoid worms swarmed over, he would no longer have the opportunity to summon the alchemy colossus. At the thought of this, Angelano didn't dare to delay at all, and he hurriedly chanted an incantation to activate the summoning array. As he did so, a large alchemy colossus soon appeared in the empty space in front of him as the ground that was covered by the alchemy array seemed to have turned into a puddle of water, while a massive alchemical statue gradually emerged from below. His alchemy colossus had now been equipped with the divine sea pillar that Lin Li had bought previously, causing faint blue light and patterns to appear on the surface of the entire alchemy colossus. Moreover, due to the massive power of the divine sea pillar, the alchemy colossus was also faintly emitting a wisp of sanctuary-level aura. The divine sea pillar itself was condensed from a type of ocean law, and was similar to Lin Li's debris of the stars. Although the power of the divine sea pillar was not as pure and incredible as that of the debris of the stars, it was also considered quite rare in Anral. The enhancement of the divine sea pillar might not allow the alchemy colossus to immediately reach the sanctuary realm, but it was enough to allow its power to contain a trace of sanctuary-level power. That trace was not to be belittled, and it was already a qualitative change in power compared to the power below the sanctuary realm. "Let's begin now, let's kill these disgusting worms," Angelano exclaimed from inside the alchemy colossus. He gained a lot of confidence once he was in the alchemy colossus, and he smashed the spear in his hand, which resembled a giant pillar, against the humanoid worms. After evolving again and again, the humanoid worms had gained resistance to all types of magic and even obtained a powerful physical defense. However, they were limited by their genetic foundation, after all, and the resistance they obtained would still be limited. For example, the attack of the alchemy colossus was purely a suppression by force, and there was no magic involved at all. Regardless of how hard their outer shell had become, they would only end up getting crushed. Although the alchemy colossus had yet to reach the sanctuary level, its destructive power was still extremely terrifying when its physical size grew to a certain extent. Under Angelano's manipulation, the alchemy colossus showed its prowess and crushed 10 odd humanoid worms with the terrifying gigantic sword. Immediately afterwards, the alchemy colossus stepped to the side and stomped its massive foot of steel on the humanoid worms, crushing yet another 10 or so to death. Initially, Edmund and Zoomer had already begun contemplating if they should join the fight, but after seeing Angelano's performance, they immediately suppressed the idea. To them, the most important thing was to guard against any enemies rushing into the temple lest they disturbed Lin Li, who was drawing a Mageth. Of course, Edmund and Zoomer could not help but be taken aback by the massive power that the alchemy colossus had displayed. After all, in the opinion of most people, an alchemy colossus was an inanimate object no matter what, and couldn't possibly comprehend and master any laws like truly sentient living beings could. Hence, they thought that reaching the legendary level in strength by accumulation was already the limit, and it was simply impossible to break through to the sanctuary realm like that. However, Edmund and Zoomer could now clearly sense a trace of sanctuary level power from the alchemy colossus, which was somewhat contrary to what they knew. Of course, given Edmund and Zoomer's ability, they had already felt the aura of the divine sea pillar contained in the power of the alchemy colossus. However, it would be impossible to fully exert the power of the sanctuary realm unless one had a corresponding sanctuary level ability to control. Angelano's alchemy colossus had truly exerted the power of the sanctuary realm, even though it was only a trace of it. However, Edmund and Zoomer soon thought of Lin Li and the magic scroll that could suppress wild whale Rabu. It was just a magic scroll, and yet it could already exert the power of the divine realm. Thus, he had to be capable of making an alchemy colossus exude sanctuary level power. At the thought of that, Edmund and Zoomer felt much more confident in Lin Li, who was drawing Mageths in the temple, and were full of expectations. At this moment, Lin Li had indeed reached a very critical moment in drawing the Mageth inside the temple. Just everyone else thought he had already completed 20 out of the 24 Mageths required, and although there were only 4 Mageths left to draw, he was only halfway through the process considering the efforts and difficulty involved in drawing the last 4 Mageths. The 20 Mageths that he had already drawn had just begun to exert their power, and were constantly injecting the absorbed elements of light into the Eye of Light. They then manipulated the Eye of Light to filter out the marks that originally belonged to the ancient god of light, before using the power of light to cleanse Aquilo's body. In fact, Lin Li could already stop at this juncture because a Mageth array formed by the 20 Mageths would completely be capable of speeding up the resurrection of Aquilo. However, Lin Li was not satisfied, since his original plan was to create a Mageth array composed of 24 Mageth arrays. He had to complete it regardless of how difficult it might be. At this time, Lin Li's drawing had slowed down, and almost every inch and tiny magic symbol of the Magath would require him to commit all his energy to drawing. Although he wasn't sweating much, he had a grave expression, and he was extremely careful with each movement. In fact, the difficulty of drawing a Magath array, composed of 24 ordinary Magaths, was already unimaginable, not to mention that of drawing 24 Magaths to form a Magath array that was close to the Divine Smith level. Although Lin Li had attainments that were at the peak of the Guru level in inscription, had studied the Magaths left by the Immortal King for some time, and even used the Mount Tai magic scroll to prove and put to test what he had learned, he still had to be very careful with the Magath that would speed up the resurrection of Aquilo. Each additional Magath would double the power of the Magath array, and once he completed the last 4, there would be a 16-fold increase in strength. That would then be a Magath that Lin Li would truly consider to be near the level of the Divine Smith. In fact, the function of this Magath was to continuously absorb the power of the ancient god of light, and then inject it into Aquilo's body through the Eye of Light. Lin Li didn't know if that was the reason the ancient god of light had been suppressed in this space, but to say the least, the ancient god of light's existence was very crucial to the resurrection of Aquilo. Based on this, Lin Li began to get more and more interested in the relationship between Aquilo and the Immortal King. Although he now held the canon of the Illuminati, he would probably have to hear the truth about what happened to Aquilo back then straight from the horse's mouth. Hence, Lin Li also hoped to resurrect Aquilo sooner, and wasn't just helping the Illuminati fulfill their wishes. There was another thing that made Lin Li choose not to cut corners on this matter, and that was that he was very much looking forward to seeing what level Aquilo would reach after his resurrection. After all, injecting the power absorbed from an ancient god into a human body was like an experiment in apotheosis, which made Lin Li incredibly interested in the results. Although according to the Illuminati, the founding Saint Aquilo's strength was already at the peak of the sanctuary realm, and near the divine realm, Aquilo was still immortal because he hadn't ascended to godhood yet. Now, the power of the ancient god of light was continuously being injected into Aquilo's body, so Lin Li was very much looking forward to seeing what kind of existence Aquilo would be after his resurrection. Lin Li was completely immersed in the drawing of the Magath array, just like when he was drawing the magic scroll named Mount Tai. Outside the temple, the battle between the two teams and the humanoid worms had also reached an extremely intense point. The humanoid worms that were swarming over like a tide might not be powerful or big, but the vast number of them made up for their shortcomings. In particular, the two teams had to guard the temple behind them while they were fighting, so they were rather tied up during the battle. However, it wasn't easy for the humanoid worms to break through the team's defense and barge into the temple. Apart from the mages of the Tower of Dusk who had now formed a magic net array, the Illuminatus team wasn't that easy to deal with, either. The Illuminati had accumulated battle experience on the Endless Ocean for thousands of years, and if they hadn't had significant strength, they would have probably been devoured by other forces. The people that Saint Edmund brought this time were all elites of the Chaos Sanctuary, who used an extremely special battle formation. Although they seemed to be fighting individually in a chaotic manner, it contained various arcane laws. Although it was inferior to the magic net array of the Tower of Dusk's team, it allowed the team's power and strength to be greatly enhanced. Under the impact of the tide-like wave of humanoid worms, the team managed to stay strong like a reef that did not falter regardless of how violently the wind and waves were crashing against it. At this point, Conorus had already rushed in front of the massive humanoid worm that was as large as a hill. Conorus seemed as small as a bug, while the humanoid worm was like a hill. However, as he struck with a deafening roar, the massive humanoid worm howled, and his massive body slid backwards by a great distance. Conorus refused to concede, and immediately brandished the Eternal Frost Blade in his hand, after which several silver rays of space slash appeared and struck the giant humanoid worm before it could regain its balance. The humanoid worm lacked agility because of its massive body, so it was dodging very clumsily. The punch that Conorus swung at it threw it off balance. Next, it was struck by numerous space slashes. It had no choice but to protect itself with its large scythe-like arms. However, the portion of its body that was exposed didn't seem to have a high level of defense, as it was instantly smashed into bits by the space slashes. However, the juices of its flesh didn't seep into the desert, and instead started wriggling on the ground, turning into a bunch of smaller humanoid worms. They looked similar to the humanoid worms that were now attacking the two teams. At the same time that the juice turned into humanoid worms, the wounds on the massive body began healing at a speed that was visible to the naked eye. Seeing this, Conorus knew that the hill-like humanoid worm had to be the mother of those humanoid worms. The mother humanoid worm could give birth to generations of evolved humanoid worms, but it didn't have the ability to evolve. Otherwise, if it was really the same as the larvae, Connorus probably wouldn't be able to defeat it easily. At this moment, the mother of the humanoid worms let out an ear-piercing howl while opening its arms, after which the 2 rows of large eyes suddenly opened, glaring at Connorus. Afterwards, numerous barrel-thick pillars of light darted out at Connorus in the temple in the distance. As the giant eyes opened, Connorus immediately sensed a dangerous aura. By the time the light pillars shot over, Connorus immediately got a great fright and frantically dodged. Connorus' perfect body was comparable to the ancient Wyrm's physique, and yet he was afraid of touching the giant light pillars. Clearly, the power of the pillars was terrifying. After Connorus dodged, he immediately began to regret it. The temple was right behind him, and if the light pillars struck the crumbling temple, it would probably turn into ashes immediately. Although the level of Lin Li's strength was now significant enough to prevent him from getting hurt, his efforts in drawing the Magath would probably go down the drain. Fortunately, although Saint Edmund and Elder Zoomer hadn't joined the battle, they had been watching the changes in the situation. When they saw the attack launched by the mother humanoid worm, Elder Zoomer didn't dare to hesitate any longer as he immediately opened his domain world to shield the crumbling temple. As soon as Elder Zoomer's domain world was opened, the pillars of light fell in bombardment, only to hit the barrier of the domain world. Initially, Elder Zoomer thought that the power of the light pillars would probably be the same as that of the magical crystal cannons at best, but he got a great shock when he came into contact with it. The pillars of light unleashed by the mother humanoid worm might seem similar to the magical crystal cannons, but the magical crystal cannons couldn't emit power that contained sanctuary level power. Each of the pillars of light was as powerful as the full strength of a sanctuary powerhouse, and they started bombarding Elder Zoomer's domain world, causing a drastic change in the latter like it was an apocalypse. Sensing the power of the light pillars, Elder Zoomer couldn't help but be thankful that he had spent all his savings on the Divine Sea Pillar to strengthen his domain world. Otherwise, it wouldn't be certain if he could hold up this time. Even so, the barrier of his domain world was now covered with cracks under the bombardment of several pillars of light. It seemed to be on the verge of falling apart. Connorus was displeased to see that situation. The enemy that he was initially supposed to deal with ended up bringing such great danger to the team, which made him look rather bad. Damned worms, Connorus cursed furiously. Immediately afterwards, his body began expanding rapidly like it was being inflated with air. In the blink of an eye, his stature, which was originally like that of an average human, expanded to the size of Angelano's alchemy colossus. Immediately afterwards, Connorus began swinging his large fists at the mother humanoid worm. It wasn't an illusion nor an expansion spell, but a type of affinity spell of the ancient demon deity, the body of the demon deity. His punch immediately caused the mother humanoid worm to overturn and collapse on the ground. Immediately afterwards, Connorus leapt over and pinned the mother humanoid worm to the ground before punching it to the point it started howling incessantly. Seeing that Connorus had finally pinned down the mother humanoid worm, Edmund and Zoomer were secretly relieved. At the same time, the strength that Connorus showed also made them feel a little surprised. After all, Connorus had yet to even reach the sanctuary realm, but he actually managed to suppress the sanctuary-level mother humanoid worm, which was simply unbelievable. Of course, Connorus had yet to reach the sanctuary level, after all, so although he had gained an upper hand, the two teams soon reached a stalemate. However, even then, the mother humanoid worm didn't have the energy to do anything else, and merely went toe-to-toe against Connorus. In the blink of an eye, the Tower of Dusks and the Illuminatus team had already fought the humanoid worms for a few days, in which time the surrounding space had also gradually changed. Apart from the temple where the ancient god of light was suppressed, it seemed to be nighttime in the other places as the elements of light that had originally filled the space now gathered in this side of the temple. The only source of power of light for the temple was the ancient god of light. That made Edmund and Zoomer feel somewhat excited. Clearly, Lin Li had already reached the final moment of the Magath drawing process, and might just complete it successfully soon. At some point, there was a sudden tremor that emitted from the space, and the light that enveloped the entire space suddenly converged, as if it had been sucked by something inside. The light soon reappeared. This time, it was even more dazzling than before. In fact, it even formed a solid barrier of light outside the temple. Edmund and Zoomer had yet to react, but they suddenly felt their vision blurring as a figure appeared in front of them in a flash. It was Lin Li, who had been drawing Magaths in the temple. Although he already had an answer in his heart, Edmund nevertheless somewhat apprehensively asked President Flick, "How is the situation? Has the Magath been completed successfully?" Although Lin Li seemed a little fatigued, he was also completely relaxed. He nodded, and said, "Fortunately, the Magath was completed successfully." To him, drawing the Magath this time was not just meant for fulfilling the wishes of the Illuminati, because it had also given him plenty of inspiration that allowed him to make another considerable breakthrough in his attainments in the field of inscription. On the other hand, both Edmund and Zoomer couldn't contain their joy after hearing Lin Li's affirmative reply. Edmund suppressed his excitement and then asked Lin Li, "President Falik, when will Lord Aquilo be resurrected now with the help of the Magath you have drawn?" Edmund and the others only knew that with the help of the Magath that Lin Li had drawn, the resurrection of Lord Aquilo would be completed ahead of schedule, though the duration by which it was shortened was uncertain. It could be a year or perhaps decades. Although they didn't specify the number of years by which they wanted Lord Aquilo to be resurrected sooner when asking Lin Li for help, they inevitably had some expectations which would usually seem unrealistic. Lin Li did not keep them in suspense. After making some calculations in his head, he said, "My current attainments in inscription are still far from the true divine smith level. Although I have succeeded in drawing the Magath successfully, this Magath is not at the divine smith level, after all. Hence, it won't be able to make this resurrection speed increase by much." The hearts of Edmund and Zoomer sank when they heard Lin Li's answer. Can it really be brought forward by only a few years? If that's the case, it won't make much of a difference. However, Lin Li did not bother looking at their expressions. Instead, he turned to look at the ongoing battle in the distance while nonchalantly saying, "It will be sped up by about 2 times. But apart from the role of Magaths, it also depends on Saint Aquilo himself. If he can work well with the Magath, he might be able to be resurrected even earlier than that. So it's going to take half the time it would originally have taken." Edmund and Zoomer were both so agitated that they were on the verge of tears. The result had far exceeded their expectations. After waiting for thousands of years, it was finally time for them to see some results. Even a peak sanctuary level powerhouse like Edmund could barely control his emotions at this point. However, Lin Li completely ignored Edmund's and Zoomer's reaction. Instead, he seemed to be more interested in those humanoid worms. In fact, after seeing those humanoid worms, he could already sense an aura that was rather similar to that of the light-winged angels they had encountered previously. Lin Li was certain that the humanoid worms were definitely creatures that did not belong to this world, and had probably been created by some fallen deities in their own divine kingdom. With Lin Li's strength, it would be a piece of cake to destroy the humanoid worms. Even the mother humanoid worm that was fighting with Connorus could not stop him in the slightest. However, he did not strike immediately, because he already felt that Connorus' strength seemed to have increased greatly during the battle with the mother humanoid worm. Hence, he thought that the ordinary humanoid worms could be used to hone the mages of the Mage Legion. Since Lin Li had finished drawing the Magaths, the two teams naturally stopped focusing entirely on shielding the temple, because there was no longer a need to. Instead, they launched a counterattack against the humanoid worms. The mages of the Tower of Dusk and the members of the Illuminatus team were all elites among their peers to begin with. Once they stopped having any scruples, there was a huge change in the battle situation. Even though the humanoid worms had gained a variety of abilities through evolution, they still couldn't stop the elites of both teams from slaughtering them. The mages of the Tower of Dusk were constantly casting all kinds of magic spells, which then continuously blasted at the humanoid worms and turned them into bits like a thunderstorm. The Illuminatus team didn't fall far behind, either. The sword sages waved their sharp swords and began casting chaos magic spells that killed the humanoid worms. In particular, Angelano's alchemy colossus was fighting mightily like Optimus Prime as it smashed the spear hard against the ground, smashing dozens of humanoid worms into bits. With a casual stomp of its foot, the alchemy colossus crushed the humanoid worms into badly mangled corpses. During the battle over the past few days, the number of humanoid worms that had been killed had probably reached hundreds of millions. Of course, the real deciding factor for victory was still the battle between Connorus and the mother humanoid worm. Even Connorus didn't expect to have fused even further with the perfect body after the past few days of fighting. Perhaps it might sound insignificant, but it had resulted in a world of a difference in Connorus' strength. It was as if he had become another person. Connorus could even feel that the door to the sanctuary realm had opened to him, and he could step into it as soon as he put his foot forward. That feeling made him feel extremely excited, but it was unfortunate for his opponent, the mother of the humanoid worms. If it couldn't defeat Connorus then and now, it didn't stand a chance at all. Connorus flipped the mother humanoid worm onto the ground again. Immediately afterwards, he strode over to sit on it, with one hand pressed against its body. He then grabbed the humanoid worm's scythe-like forearm with his other hand. As Connorus' muscles bulged, a hissing sound could be heard as he ripped the mother humanoid worm's forearm off resolutely. In the face of the humanoid worm's wailing, Connorus did not hesitate to strike at all. Instead, he cupped the humanoid worm's skull with both hands and then headbutted it with all his might. When the head of the mother humanoid worm was sent flying from its massive body, it actually disintegrated with a loud bang and turned into countless light orbs that flew towards the temple before fusing with the light barrier. There was now only a 2.3-meter tall monument at the place where the mother humanoid worm was originally at. With the death of the mother humanoid worm, the remaining humanoid worms also turned into light orbs and flew into the light barrier of the temple one after another. The Illuminatus and Tower of Dusk's team were the only ones remaining on the entire battlefield at the moment. Even the corpses of those humanoid worms had surprisingly vanished too. If not for the mess on the ground, it would seem as if the battle had never happened. At this moment, Connorus lifted the body of the demon deity spell and grabbed the stone tablet left behind by the mother humanoid worm. He then flew close to Lin Li and said, "Fulik, take a look at this thing. Can you read what's written on it?" There were some words written on the stone tablet, but they were in a language that dated back to even before the prehistoric times. It was a language from the early era of myths. Lin Li couldn't identify the font completely, and could only vaguely identify a few words, based on the notes left behind by the immortal king. Sylvia, the god of insects, father, calamity, collapse, fall of the gods. Lin Li couldn't derive much information from the stone tablet, and merely knew that it seemed to be from a deity known as the god of insects. Clearly, the god of insects had also fallen in this space, just like the god of bravery. Besides, the word, gods, was also stated on the stone tablet, so Lin Li reckoned that it was probably not just referring to the god of insects and the god of bravery. Perhaps there were many other gods that had fallen there too. In fact, when he'd first come to explore this place, Lin Li had already guessed that it was certainly not as simple as a place where the ancient god of light was suppressed. The subsequent discovery of the temple of the god of bravery had at least also proven that this place was indeed not just meant for the suppression of the ancient god of light. Lin Li could vaguely feel a tinge of godly aura from the stone tablet, and he reckoned that the mother humanoid worm had managed to survive the destruction of the divine kingdom, largely because it had swallowed the stone tablet. Of course, Lin Li wasn't that interested in those disgusting creatures like the humanoid worms, but he reckoned that the stone tablet, that carried a tinge of godly aura, could still be used for something. On the other hand, Edmund and Zoomer were both completely immersed in the joy of the imminent resurrection of the founding saint, Lord Aquilo, so much so that they couldn't be bothered to pay attention to the stone tablet. However, after rejoicing, Edmund began to get a little worried, and came close to Lin Li. He asked President Fulik, "Do we have to arrange for people to guard the Magath?" With the previous wave of attacks from the humanoid worms that surged out like tides, Edmund and Zoomer, too, knew that this wasn't a peaceful space. God knew what other types of monsters there would be apart from the peculiar humanoid worms. If they simply ignored it, something might dash out and destroy the Magath after everyone left later. Elder Zoomer, don't worry. I'm afraid the strength of this temple's defense is not inferior to that of the place where the ancient god of light has been suppressed. If you're still worried, you may give it a try, Lin Li said nonchalantly. Although the Magath array that he had drawn was not at the level of the divine smith, it could still be considered of the demigod level. It wasn't something that just anyone could destroy. Elder Zoomer felt a little embarrassed after hearing Lin Li's words, but since it concerned the resurrection of Lord Aquilo, he ultimately had to be very careful. He immediately came close to the temple, looked at the layer of light that enveloped the temple, and slowly reached out to press his hand against it. As soon as he did, Elder Zoomer immediately discovered that the layer of light seemed to feel like a tangible object when he pressed it. Besides, as he began to stimulate his mana, the layer of light began to develop a strong resistance to it. In fact, it even seemed to be increasing simultaneously with the increase in the power of his mana. Even when Elder Zoomer increased his mana to the point of being equivalent to a powerful sanctuary-level magic spell, his palm still didn't advance by a single millimeter. Although he wasn't using magic to blast the layer of light, Elder Zoomer was certain that even if he exerted all his power, it would be impossible to penetrate it, and he might even get hurt by the force of the light's retaliation. At this moment, Saint Edmund, too, spoke up with an unconcealed excitement in his eyes. He said, "All right, Zoomer, you don't have to try anymore. I'm afraid even I won't be able to break this layer of light. Saint, this layer of defense is indeed much stronger than I thought. However, it seems a little exaggerated to say that even you can't break it," said Elder Zoomer, who wasn't quite convinced by Edmund's words. After all, the main function of the Magath was to speed up the resurrection of Saint Aquilo, not defend. Saint Edmund was a peak sanctuary-level expert, who, although he hadn't reached the demigod level, was still already a top existence in the sanctuary realm. If even he said he couldn't break the defense, perhaps only a god would be able to do so. In fact, even real gods, that hadn't reached the level of the ancient god of light, would probably be unable to destroy the layer of light that was enveloping the temple, much less enter to destroy the Mageth. If it was just a defense put up by the Mageth array that Lin Li had drawn, it naturally wouldn't be that powerful. However, it was connected to the Mageth that suppressed the ancient god of light. The power used in this layer of light was derived from the ancient god of light. As long as the ancient god of light's power was not exhausted, no one would be able to break this layer of defense. Apart from the immortal king, who had suppressed the ancient god of light, nothing in this space could have such great power. In fact, not to mention the others, even Lin Li who'd drawn the Mageth array couldn't enter the temple easily at this moment. The entire temple seemed to have been shrouded in light, but in fact, it was filled with elements of light that had condensed in every inch of space, becoming incredibly dense and solid. Only Lord Aquilo of the Illuminati could remain in it safely with the help of the Illuminate's holy artifact, the Eye of Light. Although Saint Edmund didn't reach out to test it, he could roughly tell how powerful the defense was based on Elder Zoomer's behavior and the power he sensed from the layer of light. Hence, he asked Elder Zoomer to stop before turning around to look at Lin Li. He then said with a sincere expression, "President Flick, thank you so much for this." For the entire Illuminati, resurrecting the founding Saint Aquilo was one of the top priorities, something which the Illuminati had been waiting for thousands of years to carry out. Although it was supposedly just a deal between Lin Li and the Illuminati where Lin Li asked to read their canon in exchange, the Illuminati would undoubtedly get the better end of the deal if Aquilo could really be resurrected. Hence, even though Edmund had such a high status, he couldn't help but thank Lin Li with utmost sincerity. However, right after Edmund thanked Lin Li, the ground suddenly began vibrating violently before Lin Li could respond. Next, a massive rift appeared on the ground in a distant spot that had already turned dim. The scene looked just like an apocalypse. That situation immediately made everyone here tense up again as they nervously wondered if a terrifying creature was about to emerge once more. Although the humanoid worms that they had just faced hadn't done much damage to the two teams, they gave them an idea of the terror of this space, and God knew what kinds of monsters were lurking there. At this moment, Lin Li made eye contact with Edmund and the rest, after which they flew unanimously towards the rift, soon coming close to it. Edmund and the others were worried that if something powerful emerged from within, it would affect the resurrection of Saint Aquilo. However, Lin Li could vaguely sense a familiar aura coming from the rift. When he came close to the crack, Edmund immediately dispersed his mental strength to find out what was hidden underneath the rift, and whether there was a powerful existence that would threaten Aquilo's resurrection. However, before he could even find anything, Edmund suddenly turned pale as if he had suffered a huge blow, and it was as if there was a force that was pushing his body backwards. Elder Zoomer, who was at the side, panicked when he saw that situation, and he quickly reached out to hold Edmund and stop him from falling. He anxiously asked, "Saint, is there something under the rift?" Before Edmund could answer, there were once again strange occurrences in the rift as it seemed as if there were countless voices yelling from below. Even though they were not yelling in a modern language, the meaning of their words seemed to have appeared clearly in their minds. "Let me out. Save me. I want to go out." The even more shocking thing was that there was a sacred majesty hidden in the miserable screams. Such a sacred might often belong to the gods, who were high up on pedestals, and was bound to make one feel reverent. However, it had now appeared together with miserable wails that sounded even more tragic than beggars begging for food. The two were complete extremes. Saint Edmund began to recover at this point. Just now, it was precisely because his mental strength had touched the sacred aura under the rift that he felt an unbearable discomfort that felt like thunder roaring in the depths of his soul. He then looked at Lin Li and said, "Master Flick, how do you plan to deal with this rift?" In Edmund's opinion, they couldn't let such a threat exist at this moment. Otherwise, once he and the others left, they would be in trouble once a powerful monster or creature emerged from the rift. However, if he were to just go in and explore, he wouldn't be confident, especially because of the pressure that his mental strength had just sensed. Hence, Edmund thought of Lin Li as he hoped that Lin Li and the team from the Tower of Dusk could follow him to explore the rift again. However, Lin Li came here with Edmund solely for the sake of drawing the Mageth, and he didn't say that he would help them solve their problems. Edmund was well aware of that himself, hence, he felt a little conflicted and wanted to ask Lin Li for his opinion. Lin Li looked at the rift. Even though he could sense the aura of the immortal king, he didn't intend to explore it at this moment. Just like Edmund, he also felt the sacred aura under the crack, and he was even more certain that it wasn't as simple as a sacred aura. Thinking about the fall of the gods as stated on the tablet, Lin Li had no choice but to consider the possibility that the owner of that sacred aura was very likely not a sacred being. Although Lin Li was eager to find out the immortal king's trail, he also knew what his strength was really like, and was aware of what he could and could not do with his strength. Although Lin Li was very tempted by the rift, he was aware of the great dangers involved. Even though he was confident in his abilities, he didn't dare to think about it now. If a divine-level being were to appear just like what he was worried about, it would be too late to regret. Gods were gods. Back then, the demigod high priest Power managed to put Lin Li in a disheveled state. Lin Li managed to get rid of him only with the help of the immortal king's suppression mageth. Even if an enemy as powerful as high priest Power emerged now, Lin Li probably wouldn't be able to get any advantage. Hence, in the face of Saint Edmund's question, Lin Li merely slowly shook his head and said, "Sorry, Saint Edmund. I'm sure you felt the aura in this rift. It's no longer something that we can deal with given our current strength. However, judging from those voices, they probably won't be able to emerge from the rift, so you don't have to worry too much about the resurrection of Saint Aquilo." There was some truth to Lin Li's words. The existences that contained a sacred might would have probably all rushed out by themselves by now if they weren't restrained by something. There was no need for them to stoop low and ask for help. However, just because they couldn't come up, it didn't mean that there was no danger under the rift. Who knew to what extent they were being restrained? If they merely couldn't get out of the rift, the members of the Illuminati and the Tower of Dusk would be courting death if they went down into the rift. Lin Li was very brave, but he wouldn't take the risk to do such an insignificant thing in such a dangerous place. Although it was true that the Immortal King's aura existed in that crack, it didn't mean that Lin Li would go there immediately. Perhaps he would return again to find out what was going on when he reached the level of a demigod. However, he was still a far cry from that for now. After speaking to Edmund, Lin Li instructed the mages to immediately prepare to retreat without any hesitation. Not many people could be as decisive as him in the face of such a huge temptation. To Lin Li, the trace of the Immortal King's aura was of extraordinary significance, but not enough to make him lose sight of his priorities. However, after hearing Lin Li's words, Edmund and Zoomer panicked a little. Even though Lin Li had already told them not to worry, they couldn't really relax, because it concerned the goal that the Illuminati had been painstakingly working towards for thousands of years. It would have been fine if there had been no special aura in that crack, but the problem was that there was such a peculiar aura that was impossible for them to ignore. "President Flick, please wait, I know it's making things difficult for you, but can we have a chat about this? The sudden appearance of this rift will definitely give us sleepless nights if we don't explore it," Saint Edmund said with a look of dismay, in hopes that he could persuade Lin Li to go with him to explore the rift. "Yeah, President Flick, if you have any requests please feel free to say so. As long as we can find out the situation in this rift, we won't take a single share of the spoils from the exploration," Elder Zoomer chimed in, making a generous promise to let the Tower of Dusk have all the spoils that they discovered during the exploration, should there be any. Hearing their words, Lin Li couldn't help but laugh, and said, "Stop saying that. You guys, even if there are good items, you need to be alive to use them. Both of you must have sensed the aura in the rift, and whatever is inside is by no means something that a person of the sanctuary realm can touch. As for the Mageth, you can rest assured that as long as the power of that ancient god of light does not decline, even a god won't be able to destroy it. Now, we'd better get out of here." After saying that, Lin Li left with his subordinates in the direction that he came from. However, at this moment, a massive mana wave suddenly emerged from the rift in the ground, instantly attracting everyone's attention. Next, a white skeleton arm emerged from it, and seemed to be facing great difficulty while grabbing the edges of the rift. Before the crowd could react, another skeleton arm stretched out from the side and tried to grab the edge. Next, force was applied by both arms, and a skeleton head that seemed to have been carved out of jade slowly popped out of the dark rift. Things were much simpler next. The white skeleton leaned forward slowly and put a leg on the edge of the rift, after which it dawdled for a while before crawling out of the rift. When it stood up near the edge of the rift, everyone finally saw a small skeleton that had a stature of less than 1.5 meters. Undead creature. Undead creatures were no strangers to those who were present. In fact, they were even more familiar with the skeletal warriors, who were the cannon fodder among undead creatures. However, they felt rather puzzled by the bizarreness of the fact that such a petite skeleton crawled out of the rift that they were so afraid of. The skeleton that crawled out of the rift scanned its surroundings, and the soul fire in its eyes flickered twice when it saw the two teams. It then walked towards them. It was just a skeleton, and even if it was in existence like a skeleton king, it would still only be at the legendary level. However, with each step that the skeleton took towards the crowd, there was a significant enhancement of the mana fluctuations around its body. Step by step, it turned from an inconspicuous being into an existence whose strength was at the legendary realm, and eventually the sanctuary realm. When the skeleton stopped again, the mana fluctuations of its body actually reached the peak of the sanctuary realm, and there was even a vague trace of the aura of the gods. Demigod, Edmund and the others were stunned because the skeleton seemed to be on par with High Priest Power, who had been bewitched by the ancient god of light. However, it was a terrifying existence that was already as powerful as Wild Whale Rabu. Although Edmund was a powerhouse who was at the peak of the sanctuary realm, he still hadn't touched the arcane mysteries of the divine realm, and was a far cry from demigods. Faced with a skeleton that was at the level of a demigod, Edmund couldn't help but feel uneasy, because he knew that he was no match for it. The others were in an even more wretched state when facing the powerful pressure of the demigod. The mages of the Tower of Dusk were still struggling to rely on the magic net array to support themselves, but the members of the Illuminati were almost about to get on their knees as they were panic-stricken. The skeleton took another step toward the crowd. The two teams involuntarily took a few steps back in unison. In fact, when some of the members of the Illuminatus team were retreating, they fell backwards because they couldn't withstand the pressure of the divine. However, no one dared to laugh at those who had fallen onto the ground, because all they could see was the skeleton that was walking towards them, one step at a time. Edmund and Zoomer had already subconsciously raised their staffs, and it was as if they would attack the skeleton as long as it took another step closer. The mysterious skeleton had clearly brought great pressure to the two of them because a demigod was definitely not that easy to deal with. Under the previous siege of so many sanctuary powerhouses, Wild Whale Rabu hadn't even shown a single sign of defeat, and instead forced many sanctuary powerhouses into dire straits. If it weren't for Lin Li's magic scroll, the Gilded Kingdom would have probably been removed from the endless ocean by now. The skeleton was a demigod too, so it was no wonder that Edmund and the others would be that tense. However, at this juncture, something even more shocking happened. The demigod-level skeleton that had crawled out of the rift actually fell to the ground on one knee in front of Lin Li in plain sight. "Great Master, you finally arrived. The former master has left something for you, and it's time for me to hand it over to you. Please come with me to take a look." The jaw of the demigod skeleton kept moving, and its voice was extraordinarily clear in this silent space. "Master," the demigod-level skeleton actually called President Fulik his master. When Edmund and the others heard that, they were flabbergasted and bewildered. In this world, sanctuary powerhouses were top-level existences, and very few would acknowledge others to be their masters, let alone a powerhouse that was close to becoming a god. However, the skeleton was now calling a sanctuary powerhouse his master, which was a stark contrast to the image of demigods that everyone had in their minds. Surprisingly, Lin Li didn't seem shocked at all. In fact, when the little skeleton appeared, he already recognized that it was the same skeleton that was waiting for him on the star in the world created by Garesco. That also provided an explanation for a doubt that Lin Li had as he finally understood why he would board the star and come all the way here in the world that Garesco had created. Clearly, he wasn't the only one who came here. Garesco, the god of mages, had also been there. Otherwise, there was no way the skeleton would be there. It was obvious that Garesco was the one who had arranged for Lin Li to see everything that he had in the world created by Garesco. Otherwise, there was no way Garesco could have seen the immortal king suppressing the ancient god of light, because that had happened several thousand years ago, way before Garesco was born. However, Lin Li had yet another question. What was the relationship between Garesco and the immortal king? Why did Garesco track the trail of the immortal king and arrange for Lin Li to continue doing such a thing? What was he trying to achieve? The answer to his questions might well be in the rift that the skeleton had crawled out from. Lin Li initially didn't plan to touch the rift even though he could vaguely sense the aura of the immortal king. However, after hearing what the skeleton said, Lin Li finally felt tempted. Of course, another important reason was that the appearance of the little skeleton had proven that although the rift was terrifying, it probably shouldn't be too dangerous. "Okay, I'll go with you." Lin Li finally nodded. After instructing them to stay put, Lin Li followed the petite white skeleton to the rift in the ground. The closer he got to it, the more Lin Li could feel the chaotic aura of the gods. It was as if there was still an unknown number of gods waiting underneath the rift. Standing in front of the rift, Lin Li finally knew why the little skeleton that was at the demigod level had crawled out of the rift. There was a wave of power that drained all the people who entered of their power. It was just like a powerful domain. Fortunately, Lin Li was extremely familiar with that power as it came from the same source as the power of the ancient god of light. Given Lin Li's research on the immortal king's Mageth, it wasn't difficult for him to resist the effects of the power. At the same time, Lin Li also had an answer for the appearance of the rift. The Mageth array that he had created for the Illuminati was actually done with the knowledge he had gained from studying the immortal king's Mageth. When the elements of light in the space converged because of the Mageth array, it was probably a precursor for the appearance of the rift. Standing in front of the crack, Lin Li stretched out his fingers and drew a few strokes in the air, which immediately caused countless magic runes to fly out of the space. Like fine specks of dust, the magic runes converged in accordance with the traces Lin Li had drawn, and then exploded with a loud thud, before shrouding him and the skeleton. Lin Li immediately sensed that the force that suppressed his mana had begun to dissipate and move away from him like a tide. The little skeleton next to him had clearly felt the change too, but it didn't seem shocked at all, as if it was exactly what should have happened. Indeed, a considerable amount of research on the Immortal King's Mageth was required for the appearance of the rift to be triggered. With the achievements in the research on the Mageth, it was naturally not difficult to avoid the power of the suppression. The skeleton had stayed in the rift and waited for its master for countless years, so it should naturally be clear about this. Lin Li didn't ask much about this trick, and simply followed the skeleton straight to the bottom of the rift, which wasn't too large, and was probably only a few hundred meters deep and more than 10 meters wide. However, Lin Li felt as if he had entered an inverted funnel as the further down he flew, the larger the surrounding space became. When he was about to reach the ground, the space seemed to have become the same as that above the rift. The next thing Lin Li saw was a rather conspicuous mage tower. Although there were 12 floors to the mage tower, that seemed great and majestic, each floor was only about 3 or 4 meters high. The completely black tower was made of an unknown material, and seemed to have ordinary magical waves, just like most ordinary mage towers in Anral. Of course, Lin Li was not so superficial as to underestimate the value of the mage tower just because of its inconspicuous aura and size. Therefore, after feeling slightly surprised, he followed the little skeleton into the door of the mage tower. Lin Li got a great shock after he entered. The space inside the tower was extremely different from what was outside, but it wasn't a big deal, as it was just an application of the laws of space. Although not all mage towers had such an extravagant usage of the laws of space to expand the space, it wasn't too surprising given the power of the Immortal King or Garesco. However, what really shocked Lin Li was the things on the first floor. The first floor of the mage tower had a floor area of about more than 10,000 square meters, and a height of nearly 100 meters. There were dozens of huge crystal containers placed around the hall, and each of them had a height of tens of meters, resembling crystal towers. However, they were actually just clear and crystalline in appearance. Lin Li had already sensed that they were made from the condensation of a massive amount of mana, based on the magical waves they emitted. The magic runes could be seen flowing like water in the containers that were made of condensed mana. There were several masses of light in the container. The miserable cries of help that came from the rift previously were actually emitted continuously from the masses of light, which were emitting a faint sacred might. It turned out to be numerous gods that had been sealed. Lin Li could no longer put his emotions into words after getting the answer. The numerous gods seemed like experimental subjects that were being suppressed there. Could there be anything more exaggerated and incredible in this world? Lin Li could sense from the laws that the other party had mastered that the gods in the first hall here should all be lower-ranked gods because the laws that were mastered by them were relatively low-level laws. For example, there was the god of trees that had mastered the laws of plants and trees, the god of thorns, the god of flowers, the god of dust, and so on. The low-level gods were far from being comparable to the god of bravery, let alone the ancient god of light.
Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share, and subscribe. Have a great day.